The North Gate, Wyoming, 1885. The horse screamed once, and then the ground wasn't there anymore. The rider pitched forward over its neck, straight down into the dark, and the sound that came back up out of that hole wasn't like anything ordinary earth is supposed to make, a sound with a bottom to it. The other two hauled their reins. Neither man spoke. The high plains wind moved through the fence wire, thin and low, like something breathing. Then there was fire. A torch separated itself from the shadow of the smokehouse. It came on. Slow, unhurried. Slow the way a person walks when they already know how the night ends. The hands holding that torch were empty. No rifle, no revolver, nothing. And that was the part that put ice down the last rider's spine. They'd hired him to frighten a widow. They'd told him, a woman alone, unarmed. Nobody told him this ground had been waiting 13 years for him. The horse took a step back. The torch took a step forward. And a voice came out of the dark, level and quiet, and started counting 4, Wyoming territory, 1885. 3 men rode toward the Voss place at dusk. They did not ride back, not one of them, because that's how this story starts. Not with a scream, not with a gunshot, with silence. Silence that has weight to it, the kind that presses on your chest before you even know why. The sky over the high plains was the color of a bruise that evening, purple bleeding into black, and the wind, always the wind out here, moved through the grass like something breathing. Somewhere behind them, 60 miles south, a man was counting money he thought he'd earned honestly. Somewhere further still, a judge was signing his own name to a lie he'd told himself so many times it had started to feel like truth. And somewhere ahead, past a gate that looked easier to cross than it was, a woman knelt in the dark, listening to hooves she'd known, somewhere in her bones, were eventually going to come. None of them knew yet how the night would end. Only one of them was ready for it. 3 men. Hired hands. Cheap ones. The kind you send when you don't respect the target enough to send anyone good. Their names don't matter. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Because by morning, 2 of them would be nothing but names on a list nobody wanted to read out loud. And the third would live, which was worse. For him. He'd stumble into Rock Springs before sunup, half out of his mind, clothes torn, hands shaking so bad he couldn't hold a coffee cup. And when the sheriff asked him what happened out there, what he saw, he wouldn't answer. Couldn't. Just kept saying the same 4 words, over and over, like a prayer he didn't believe in anymore. She never touched a gun. That was the whole story. Right there. Everything you need to know about Adeline Voss, packed into 4 words spoken by a broken man who used to think he was tough. She never touched a gun, and she ended them anyway. Let's go back. 2 hours earlier. Before the screaming. Before the running. Back to when the sun was still up and the world still made sense. Adeline Voss was kneeling in her garden. 27 years old. Hands in the dirt. Sleeves rolled to the elbow. Hair the color of wheat before harvest, tied back loose. A few strands escaping the way they always did by afternoon. She was beautiful. People said so. Said it like it confused them. Like beauty, and what she was, whatever she was, didn't belong in the same sentence. They were wrong about that. About a lot of things. She pulled a weed. Set it in the basket beside her. Pulled another. Her hands were not soft. Farm hands never are. Calluses at the base of each finger. A thin white scar across her left palm that nobody in town had ever asked about. Because nobody in town got close enough to ask. That was fine with her. She liked the quiet. Her days ran the same shape most seasons. Up before full the sun, coffee boiled black over a fire she built from habit more than thought. The animals fed before she fed herself, because a hungry animal complained louder than a hungry woman ever did. Cattle counted, twice the way her father taught her to count anything that mattered. Fences walked, at least a stretch of them, every single morning, not because they needed daily inspection, but because walking them let her read the land the way another woman might read a letter, checking for anything that had shifted in the night. Afternoons belonged to whatever the season demanded. Garden in summer, firewood in autumn, mending in the deep, cold months, when the ground itself seemed to go quiet, along with everything living on it. Evenings belonged to her, briefly, before the work started again the next day, at the same relentless hour. It was a hard life. She'd never once pretended otherwise. Not to herself. Not to the handful of people who knew her well enough to ask, honestly. But it was a life she'd built herself, board by board and fence post by fence post. Out of the wreckage 2 funerals had left behind, and there was a kind of ownership in that, a kind of authorship that made the hardness worth carrying. Nobody had given her this land. Nobody was going to take it either. Except quiet. Out here wasn't really quiet. Not if you knew how to listen. There was the wind through the fence wire, the low complaint of a cow in the far pasture, the creak of the windmill, turning slow pumping water up from a well. Nobody in Rock Springs had ever measured the true depth of. Nobody asked about that either. She stood, brushed the dirt from her knees, looked out at her land, flat and gold and endless, running to the base of the Wind River foothills in the distance. And for one moment, just one, she let herself feel something close to peace. It didn't last. It never did. Because peace, for Adeline Voss, was a thing you borrowed, never owned, always had to give back eventually. Her father taught her that, before he died. Elias Voss, a name that used to mean something out here. Frontier scout, deputy marshal for 6 years in a town that chewed up deputy marshals and spat out their bones. A man who could put a bullet through a playing card at 40 paces without seeming to aim. He taught his daughter everything. How to read a trail. How to gauge the wind before a shot. How to sit a horse so quiet, the horse forgot you were there. How to shoot. God, could she shoot? Even now. Even after everything. Some nights she'd catch herself watching a hawk cut across the sky, and her hand would twitch, just slightly, like it remembered a weight it hadn't carried in 13 years. Like muscle memory doesn't care what your heart decided. Because that's the thing nobody tells you about grief. Shaped like a promise. It doesn't ask permission, it just moves in. Takes the room at the end of the hall. Never leaves. She was 14 the day it happened. A dispute in the street. Nothing that should have mattered. A drunk cattleman and a debt he didn't want to pay. Her father stepped between 2 drawn guns the way he always did. Calm, steady, hands raised. The voice of a man who'd talked 100 men down off 100 ledges, except this time. Except the drunk man's hand slipped. Except the shot that was never meant to fire went off anyway, and it didn't hit the man it was aimed at. It hit the man standing between them. It hit her father, and Adeline was 14 years old standing on a boardwalk in the mud, watching the only person who ever made her feel safe fold to his knees like his strings had been cut. She caught him. She remembers that part clearly. Catching him. His weight. Heavier than she expected. Heavier than a person should be able to feel in a moment like that. He looked up at her. Didn't say anything important, no last wisdom. No speech. Just her name. Once. Addie. And then he was gone. Just like that. A legend. A protector. A father. Turned into weight in his daughter's arms because of a gun that went off by accident in the hands of a man who didn't even mean to fire it. An accident. That was the word the town used. Accident. Like it made it smaller somehow. Like it made it easier to carry. It didn't. She buried her father with his own revolver, still in its holster. Never fired. Never drawn. And she swore, right there at the grave. Dirt still fresh, the whole town watching a 14-year-old girl who wasn't crying anymore because she'd run out of tears somewhere between the boardwalk and the burial. She swore she would never touch a gun again. Not because she couldn't shoot. Because she could. Because she was, by every measure that mattered, better than half the men who ever wore a badge in that territory. Because guns didn't protect people. Guns killed the people who trusted them the most. 13 years is a long time to keep a promise made at a graveside. She kept it, which meant she had to become something else. Something the men who came for her, and men would come. They always did. That's the shape of the world. When you're a woman alone on good land, something those men would never see coming. Her father taught her to shoot. But before that, before the badge and the reputation and the legend, he'd been an engineer. Army Corps, back during the war. Built bridges. Dug trenches. Understood ground the way most men understand faces. Instantly, instinctively, reading the little signs nobody else notices. He taught her that, too. How ground remembers. How water wants to go somewhere. And if you let it, it'll go exactly where you point it. How a man walking in the dark trusts his feet more than his eyes. And a man who trusts his feet can be led, herded, placed, exactly where you want him. Adeline didn't become a gunslinger. She became something the Old West didn't have a word for yet. An architect. of consequence. Her husband understood that about her, understood it and loved her for it, which was rarer than people think. Thomas Voss, mining engineer, came out from Pennsylvania with soft and a mind like a steel trap, and somehow, nobody quite knew how, fell for the quiet woman who ran cattle on the edge of town and never once carried a weapon into it. He used to say she thought in 3 dimensions. Where other people saw a field, she saw water tables, drainage, the slow, patient math of erosion. He used to say that with a kind of wonder in his voice, like he'd married someone extraordinary, and couldn't quite believe his luck. They'd met at a land auction, of all places, Adeline 19, there to bid on a parcel adjoining her father's old claim. The only woman in a room full of men who assumed the seat beside her was empty because no husband had claimed it yet. Thomas hadn't assumed that. He'd simply asked, quiet and direct, whether the empty chair belonged to anyone, and when she said it didn't, he'd sat down and said nothing else for the better part of an hour, watching the bidding the way he watched everything. Patient, calculating, already 3 moves ahead of the men around him. He didn't court her the way other men tried to. No flowers picked from her own garden and presented like they were a gift instead of a theft. No practiced compliments about her hair or her hands. He brought her a survey map instead on their second meeting and asked her opinion on a drainage problem at a claim he was consulting on. And when she had it faster than he had, sketching the water table in the margin without being asked, he'd looked at her the way a man looks at something he didn't know he'd been searching for. Because he told her once, years into the marriage, lying awake beside her after a long day of fence work, that most men wanted a wife who'd admire what they built, which he never wanted, except a partner who could tell him when what he'd built was wrong, before it fell down around them both. They married in Rock Springs, in a ceremony small enough to fit in Otis Pratt's back room. Her father, 4 years dead by then, no family left to walk her down an aisle that didn't exist anyway. Thomas had cried at the wedding, unashamed of it in a way she'd never seen in a man before, and she'd stood there dry-eyed, same as she'd stood dry-eyed at her father's grave, and understood, even then, that she'd found someone who didn't need her tears to know what she felt. He was right. He was also dead. 2 years now. A cave-in at the Bitter Creek mine, 40 miles north. Timber gave way. That's what the report said. Structural failure. Nobody's fault. These things happen in mining country, the foreman told her, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands, not quite meeting her eyes. She'd nodded, thanked him for coming all that way to tell her. She hadn't believed him. Not for one second, because Thomas didn't make mistakes with timber. Thomas checked his supports twice, 3 times. It was who he was, careful to the point of being teased for it by the other engineers. Structural failure. She kept that phrase in a small, locked place in her chest, next to her father's revolver, next to the promise she made at a graveside. Waiting. For what? She didn't know yet. She'd find out soon enough. The town of Rock Springs sat 11 miles east of the Voss homestead. Coal country. Union Pacific had punched a rail line through a few years back, and the whole town had grown up around that iron artery, like a scab around a wound. Necessary, ugly, impossible to ignore. It wasn't a pretty town. Never had been. Rows of hastily built storefronts, leaning against a wind that never fully stopped. A depot that saw more freight than passengers. A saloon on nearly every corner that mattered, and a church on none of them that did. Men came through Rock Springs on their way to somewhere else more often than they came to stay. And the ones who did stay carried a particular hardness that Adeline had learned, over the years, to recognize in herself as much as in anyone else. It was a town built on extraction. Coal out of the ground, freight through the depot, money out of whoever had the least power to keep it. She'd understood that about the place long before she understood the specific shape her own extraction was about to take. And some nights, riding home from it with supplies loaded behind her saddle, she wondered whether any town built on taking things out of the earth ever really learned how to give anything back. She rode in twice a month, no more than that. Today was one of those days. She hitched her horse outside the general store, and the street did what it always did when she walked it. It went quiet, not silent, nothing so dramatic, just quieter. Conversations trailing off a half-second too late to seem accidental. Eyes following her that pretended badly not to be following her. She was used to it. didn't mean it didn't sting. A little. Every time. Inside, the store smelled like coffee beans and lamp oil, and the particular dust that got into everything out here, no matter how many doors you kept closed. The shopkeep, a heavy-set man named Otis Pratt, nodded at her the way he always did. Mrs. Voss. Otis. That was usually the whole conversation. Today it wasn't. Heard some fellas been asking around about your land, he said, kept his eyes on the ledger he was pretending to update. Strangers. 2 days back. Adeline set a small sack of flour on the counter. Didn't look up. What kind of asking? Boundary lines, water rights. Whether you, he hesitated. Whether I what? Whether you had anybody looking after you out there. Anybody with a gun? A pause. What'd you tell them? Otis finally looked up, and there was something in his face, not quite a smile. Something drier than that. Told them the truth, he said. Told them you didn't need one. He'd known Thomas, too. In the ordinary way a shopkeep knows a regular customer, and he'd never once, in 2 years, treated Adeline the way half the town did after the funeral, with a careful, pitying distance that assumed grief made a person fragile instead of simply changed. He'd kept extending her the same credit he always had, kept setting her flour on the same spot on the counter, kept talking to her like a woman running a homestead, instead of a widow to be managed. It wasn't much. She understood that. A shopkeep's ordinary decency wasn't going to stop armed men from riding onto her land in the dark. But it mattered more than Otis Pratt probably ever knew, that small, steady refusal to let her become something less than herself in his eyes, just because the world around her had decided that's what a woman alone was supposed to become. Outside, on the boardwalk, she heard the boy before she saw him. Mrs. Voss! Mrs. Voss, wait! Danny Coulter, 11 years old. Freckles across the bridge of his nose, like someone had thrown a handful of them there and never bothered to clean up. He worked cattle for the Larson spread, small for his age, all elbows and energy. He was practically vibrating. I told him, he said, breathless, skidding to a stop in front of her. I told the boys down at the livery. About the wolf. They didn't believe me. About the wolf, you remember. Last winter. The one that got into the north pasture. She remembered. A gray wolf, half-starved, desperate the way winter makes things desperate. It had gotten past her fences somehow. Later she'd find where. A washout under the east line she hadn't patched yet, and it had Danny cornered against the smokehouse wall. And Danny, 10 years old that winter, didn't have a rifle, didn't have anything, just a boy's wide eyes and a wolf that hadn't eaten in 4 days. She didn't have a rifle either. She remembered crossing the yard that night with nothing but a torch pulled from the smokehouse fire and a voice pitched low and even, the way her father used to pitch his voice at a spooked horse or a cornered man. The wolf had turned toward the light, hackles raised, too hungry to be reasoned with and too wary to charge outright, and Adeline had simply kept walking, slow, unhurried, torch held low so the flame wouldn't spook it into desperation, until the animal's nerve broke before hers ever came close to it. It hadn't been about the fire. Animals, same as men, could smell a bluff from a genuine threat if you gave them long enough to decide. What that wolf had smelled, walking toward it that night, was a woman who had already decided, long before that moment, exactly how far she was willing to go to protect what belonged to her. The wolf ran. Danny lived. And a story was born that a boy would carry into every livery and saloon within riding distance for years afterward, whether anyone believed him or not. Didn't need one. You told them what? She said. Not really a question. I told them you didn't shoot it. I told them you didn't even have a gun. That you just... He spread his hands, searching for the words, the same way he must have searched for them a dozen times. Already telling this story to boys who wouldn't believe him. You had a torch in one hand, and you just walked at it. Slow. And there was this pit, right there in the yard, covered over with branches, like it had been there the whole time waiting. Danny. He stopped. She crouched down, level with him, the way her father used to crouch down to her, when something needed to be said plainly. People are going to ask you about that day for a long while, she said. Some of them won't believe you no matter what you tell them. That's all right. Let them wonder. But it happened. I know it happened. So why can't I just... Because the wondering, she said, is worth more than the answer. You understand? He didn't. Not really. He was 11 now, 10 that winter, and the difference between wondering and answering was a grown person's math he hadn't learned yet. But he nodded anyway, the way kids do when an adult says something with enough weight behind it. That arguing feels wrong, even if you don't follow the logic. She stood, ruffled his hair, which he immediately smoothed back down with wounded dignity, and that finally pulled something like a smile out of her. Small, rare, gone as fast as it came. Because across the street, under the awning of the land office, two men were watching her. Strangers. She'd never seen them before. One tall, lean, a scar cutting white through his left eyebrow. The other shorter, thicker through the shoulders, chewing something slow and unhurried. They weren't hiding that they were watching. That was the part that mattered. Men who mean you harm usually hide it, at first. These two didn't bother, which meant one of two things. Either they were fools, or they already believed they didn't need to hide anything from her, because they'd already decided how this was going to end. And because, though Adeline had no way of knowing it yet, these two men weren't hired to threaten her at all. They were hired to watch, to count her fences, her outbuildings, the absence of any man's boots on her porch, and to carry that report 60 miles south to a courier who paid for accuracy the way other men paid for whiskey. What they saw that afternoon, a widow, alone, unarmed, would become 4 sentences in a sealed letter within the week. 4 sentences that would end up in Cole Hagen's hands. She didn't linger in town. Rode home with the sun sliding down toward the Wind River Range, throwing the whole world into long gold light and longer shadows, and the ride gave her time to think, which was both a gift and a curse, because thinking, for Adeline Voss, always circled back to the same 3 questions. Who killed Thomas? Why? And when would they finally come for her too? She'd been asking those questions for 2 years. Quietly, patiently. The way her father taught her to track, not rushing, not forcing the grunts to reveal something it wasn't ready to reveal. Just watching. Waiting, letting the pattern show itself. And a pattern was showing itself. 3 homesteads sold in the last 8 months. All along the eastern boundary of Sweetwater County. All sold cheap and all sold fast, right after Union Pacific surveyors came through, marking a route for a spur line nobody in Rock Springs had voted on or been told about. Her land sat square in the middle of that route. Her land and the seam of coal that ran beneath it, the same seam, geologists said, that fed half the boilers on the transcontinental line. Thomas had mapped it. Before he died, she still had his notes, locked in the same small chest as her father's revolver, the same chest that held everything she wasn't ready to put down. Coal, not silver, not gold. Something far less romantic and far more valuable to the men who actually ran this territory, the railroad barons. The men in Cheyenne offices who never got their boots dirty and never had to. Coal that couldn't be bought from her. Because she wouldn't sell. Because Thomas had died the same month a company man first came sniffing around their land with a lowball offer and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Structural failure. She rode the last mile home with her jaw set tight and her hands steady on the reins. And if anyone had been watching her closely, really closely, they might have noticed something in her posture change. Some old readiness settling back into her shoulders like a coat she hadn't worn in years, but still remembered exactly how it fit. Because something was coming. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. A pressure in the air. A stillness that isn't peace, just the world holding its breath. She was right. South of Rock Springs, further south than most men in that county ever rode without good reason, sat the rail town of Green River. And in a rented room above a saloon there, a man named Cole Hagen was cleaning a revolver he hadn't fired in 3 weeks, which, for Hagen, was a kind of penance. He was 38, looked older, the kind of older that comes from years, not decades, years spent sleeping wrong, eating worse, carrying things a man's shoulders were never built to carry. Gray already threading through his beard, a scar along his jaw that had a story nobody had ever gotten out of him. He worked for money now. Hadn't always. There was a time, a long time ago, it felt like, though it wasn't really that long, when Cole Hagen wore a badge instead of taking bounties for it. When he'd ridden under a man named Adeline Voss, learned the trade from him, learned it the right way. Warn first. Draw last. Never shoot a man who still had a chance to walk away. Adeline Voss had pulled him out of a bar fight in Laramie when Hagen was 22 and about to get himself killed over nothing. Gave him a job instead of a beating. taught him the difference between being fast and being right, and told him more than once, in that low, steady voice of his, that the second one mattered a hell of a lot more than the first. Hagen owed that man his life. Twice over, if you counted the flood at Cybele Creek, which Hagen tried very hard not to count, because counting it meant remembering the weight of Elias Voss's hand, hauling him out of the water by the collar like he weighed nothing. He'd been at the funeral, stood in the back, didn't approach the family, didn't approach the daughter. Just watched a 14-year-old girl catch her father's whole life in her arms and understood, even then, even young as he was, that something in that girl had broken and reformed into something else entirely. Something the world hadn't seen the shape of yet. He never forgot her face that day. 13 years later, a different room, a different life. A folded piece of paper sitting on the table beside his gun cleaning kit, and on that paper, an address, and a name, and a number that made his stomach turn, even as his hands kept working the cloth along the barrel, methodical, calm, the way Elias Voss taught him to stay calm no matter what. The Voss homestead, $2,000. For a woman he was fairly certain still didn't own a gun. The man who hired him didn't give a name. Didn't need to. Hagen had worked this territory long enough to know the shape of these arrangements, without needing the details spelled out. A courier, a sealed letter, a retainer paid in cash that smelled like it had come from a bank vault in Cheyenne, not a saloon till in Green River. The courier himself was unremarkable in every way that mattered. A slight gray-suited man who never gave the same name twice and never lingered longer than the transaction required. Hagen had dealt with his kind before, men who existed entirely inside the space between an order and its execution, carrying instructions the way a bank carried money, without curiosity about where it came from or where it ultimately went. It made him useful to whoever employed him. It also made him, Hagen suspected, the last person in this entire arrangement who'd ever be held accountable for any of it, a fact that settled uneasily in Hagen's stomach every time the man appeared at his door with another folded letter and another quiet instruction. Union Pacific Business, the courier had said, careful, neutral, the way a man talks when he's been told exactly how much to reveal, and not one word more. There's a widow sitting on land the railroad needs. She's refused 3 offers. She has no husband, no sons, no men on the property. Make it clear that refusing a 4th offer would be unwise. That was the job. On paper, make it clear. Nothing more specific than that, which, in Hagen's experience, meant the man giving the order wanted room to claim, later, that he'd never actually told anyone to do anything permanent. Hagen had taken uglier jobs than this one for less money. He told himself that. Twice. Out loud, actually, alone in his room, which should have told him something about how uneasy the job was sitting with him, because there was a second reason the $2,000 mattered. His son, 12 years old, living with Hagen's sister in Cheyenne since his mother passed. And there was a debt. Hagen didn't like to think too hard about how that debt had come to exist, whose money it actually was, how deep the same railroad hands reached into every corner of this territory, if you looked closely enough. A debt that needed paying before winter, or his sister's family would lose the roof over all their heads, his boy included. $2,000 solved that. One warning visit, one widow, one piece of land. He told himself it would end there. Men in his line of work told themselves a lot of things. He didn't ride out himself, not that first time. Told himself it was strategy, not cowardice, that a man like him showing his face too early spent an advantage he might need later. Truth sat closer to something else. Truth sat closer to a reluctance he hadn't named yet. A reluctance shaped exactly like a 14-year-old girl on a boardwalk. So he did what men in his line of work did when the job felt like it might cost more than the money was worth. He sent someone else. 3 men. Cheap ones. The kind you hire when you want bodies more than skill. And Hagen didn't love that arrangement. But the courier had been specific about numbers, and Hagen had learned a long time ago not to argue with the men who signed the checks. He gave them simple instructions. Write out. Make it clear. Don't get creative. Come back and tell him it was done. He didn't tell them who Elias Voss had been. Didn't tell them anything about the daughter beyond an address and a warning to be firm, but not foolish. Some things a man keeps to himself, because saying them out loud makes them real, and real is a weight, and Hagen already had enough weight sitting on that table beside his gun cleaning kit. The three men rode out that same evening north toward Sweetwater County, toward a homestead none of them had ever seen, and a woman none of them understood even a little. They thought they were riding toward an easy afternoon's work, turned into an easy evening's work. A widow. No husband, no sons, no gun. Make it clear. That was the order they carried. They had absolutely no idea what they were actually riding into. Back at the homestead, the light was turning that particular shade of late afternoon gold that made even a hard life look, for a few minutes, almost gentle. Adeline finished with the garden, fed the chickens, checked the water level in the trough by the barn, out of habit more than need, and while she was there, she paused, looked east, toward town, toward the road that ran 11 miles to Rock Springs and, past that, further still, to places she'd never been and men she'd never met who were, at that very moment, deciding things about her future without her permission. Something felt different today. She couldn't have said what. Not exactly. Just a texture to the air, a held breath in the wind. She thought about the two strangers under the land office awning, the way they'd watched her without bothering to hide it. She thought about Otis Pratt's careful, sideways warning. She thought, and this thought arrived uninvited, the way it always did, usually at the worst moments, about Thomas, about the report that said structural failure, and meant something else entirely, about a locked chest with a revolver inside it, that had never once, in 13 years, left its holster. Never touch a gun again. That was the promise. Nobody ever said anything about not being ready. She walked the fence line that evening, every inch of it, checking the places only she knew were there. The washout by the east corner, patched now, but still a soft spot if you knew where to press. The old well 20 yards past the smokehouse, capped with a lid disguised so well even the ranch hands who'd helped Thomas dig it forgot it existed within a season. The stretch of ground near the north gate, where the earth had a particular give to it. If a horse's weight came down wrong, a give that Thomas had engineered, with the same careful mathematics he brought, to every mine shaft he ever surveyed. Traps, not the kind you set for wolves. The kind a man builds when he understands, better than almost anyone alive, exactly how the ground beneath your feet can betray you without a sound. She'd built most of it herself. In the 2 years since Thomas died. Slow, patient, one modification at a time. So no single change ever looked like more than ordinary ranch work to anyone riding past. She never told anyone why. She didn't need to. Some promises you keep by refusing the thing you swore off. Some promises you keep by becoming something. The thing you swore off was never built to stop. Night came down over the Voss homestead the way it always did out there. Fast and total, the kind of dark that swallowed the horizon whole and left only stars and the thin silver edge of a rising moon. Adeline sat on her porch step with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands. Didn't drink it, just held it. The warmth of the tin cup against her palms was the only warmth she let herself want most nights. She listened to the wind, to a coyote somewhere far off, calling and getting no answer, to the low creak of the windmill, turning, pumping water toward the barn. And underneath all of it, so faint she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it, the sound of hooves, distant, still miles off, but coming. She set the coffee cup down on the step beside her, stood, went still, the way her father used to go still before he read a room, before he decided whether a situation needed a warning or a wall. 3 riders, she'd learn later, cheap men, hired for their willingness more than their sense. They thought they were riding toward an easy afternoon's work. A widow. No husband. No sons. No gun. Make it clear. That was the order they carried. They had absolutely no idea what they were actually riding into. Adeline Voss stood on her porch in the deepening dark, listening to hoofbeats she'd known somewhere in her bones were eventually going to come, and for the first time in 2 years. For the first time since a foreman stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands and lied to her face about structural failure. She felt something that wasn't quite fear, something closer to readiness. She stepped off the porch, walked unhurried toward the barn, toward the tools that had nothing to do with guns and everything to do with the 13 years of patient, terrible preparation that had brought her to this exact moment. The barn door didn't creak. She'd oiled every hinge on that property herself, twice a year, because a sound in the dark is a warning. And warnings were something she gave to no one anymore. Not since Thomas. Not since the report that said structural failure and meant something else entirely. She moved through the dark like she'd memorized it. Because she had. Every beam, every nail, every place the floorboards gave a half-inch if you stepped wrong. She reached the far wall, found the coil of rope by feel, found the lantern she never lit unless she had to. She didn't light it. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder. 3 horses, unhurried. Men who thought they had all the time in the world. Because men who ride toward an unarmed widow usually do think that. They were wrong about the unarmed part, not about the gun. She still didn't own one. Still hadn't touched one in 13 years, and wasn't about to start tonight. Wrong about what unarmed meant. She'd built the trap 18 months ago. After the 3rd lowball offer. After the 3rd man in a clean suit rode out from Rock Springs to tell her, with a smile that never once touched his eyes, that a woman alone really ought to consider what was best for her. She'd smiled back, told him she'd think about it. Then she went to the north gate and started digging. Because that's what her father would have done. Except her father would have dug a grave for the men who threatened her. She dug something else. Something that didn't require pulling a trigger. Something that let the ground do what the ground had always been willing to do, if you understood how to ask it. A pit, 8 feet deep. Braced with mined timber, Thomas had left behind. Good timber, the kind he never would have let fail, which was its own quiet grief every time she touched it. Covered with a lattice of branches and packed earth so seamless that even she sometimes forgot exactly where the edge began. She'd studied the angle of approach for a full week before she ever broke ground, walking the north gate at every hour of the day and half the hours of the night, noting where a rider's eye naturally fell in daylight, where it fell in darkness, where the moon threw shadow long enough to hide a change in the color of the soil. She dug the walls with a slight inward taper, a trick from Thomas's own mineshaft drawings, so a man's scrambling hands would find only smooth, sloped earth instead of a handhold to climb out by. She lined the bottom with nothing sharper than packed dirt, deliberately, because a spike or a blade would have turned a stopping measure into a killing one, and killing wasn't the promise she'd made at her father's grave. It took her 11 days of careful, secretive labor, working an hour before dawn and an hour after dusk, so no rider passing the road would ever see freshly turned earth in daylight. 11 days for 1 gate. She had 4 more gates on that property, and a decade of patience still ahead of her, and she understood, even then, that this wasn't a single trap she was building. It was a language, one the whole territory would eventually learn to read, whether they meant to or not. Not to kill. She wanted that understood, even now, even in her own head, where nobody else could hear the distinction she was making. Not to kill, to stop. What happened after a man fell 8 feet into a dark hole with nothing beneath him but hard-packed dirt and a very long night to think about his choices? That part was mostly up to him. The 3 riders reached the gate at 9, maybe half past. Adeline crouched in the shadow of the smokehouse, still as stone, watching them silhouette against the rising moon. Big men, cheap coats, the kind of posture men get when they've been told the job is easy. One of them laughed at something, low, careless. She let that laugh settle into her chest like a stone dropping into still water. Because laughter, out here at night, on her land, that was a kind of insult. A promise that whatever they'd come to do, they didn't expect it to cost them anything. The lead rider reached the north gate first, which was, of course, no accident. She'd left that gate looking like the easiest way onto the property, for exactly that reason. Wide open, inviting. A path of least resistance that led directly across 11 feet of ground that wasn't ground at all. His horse's front legs went through first. The animal screamed, that terrible high sound a horse makes when the world betrays it, and the rider pitched forward over its neck, straight into 8 feet of open dark, and the crash that followed wasn't loud so much as final, a sound with a bottom to it. The second rider's horse reared, spooked, threw him hard onto the packed dirt of the yard. He didn't get up right away. The third was smarter, or luckier. Pulled his horse up short at the sound, sat frozen in the saddle for one long breath, staring into a darkness he suddenly understood. He did not comprehend at all. That was the moment Adeline stepped out of the shadow of the smokehouse. No gun in her hand, just a lit torch, and her voice low and level, carrying across the yard the way her father's voice used to carry across a room full of armed men who suddenly, inexplicably, wanted to be somewhere else. "You've got about 4 seconds," she said, "to decide whether tonight is the night you die for money you were never going to see anyway." The third rider didn't answer. He ran, left his two friends behind, one groaning in the dirt with a wrenched shoulder, one somewhere down in the dark making sounds that weren't quite words anymore, and rode east into the night like the devil himself was behind him. He wasn't wrong to think so. She didn't kill the man in the pit. Could have. There were 100 ways she could have, and every one of them would have been easier than what she actually did, which was throw down a length of rope, haul him up half-conscious with a broken wrist and a face full of dirt, tie his hands, and leave him lashed to the porch post until morning. The one with the wrenched shoulder she left, tied beside him. By sunrise, both were gone. Not dead. Gone. Untied by her at first light, with a warning delivered so quiet and so flat that neither man ever repeated it, word for word to anyone, not even each other. They rode south, never came back, which left one, the one who ran, the one who reached Rock Springs before dawn, with his eyes wide and his hands shaking, and 4 words caught in his throat that he'd repeat to a sheriff who didn't believe him, and later, much later, to a saloon full of men who believed him even less. Sheriff Ambrose Kane had seen frightened men before, had built a whole career, such as it was, of separating men who were lying, about being frightened from men who genuinely were. This one wasn't lying. He sat the man down in the jailhouse's single chair, poured coffee he knew wouldn't get drunk, and asked him plain, "Start from the beginning. Slow." "There is no beginning," the man said, his hands wrapped around the cup like it was the only solid thing left in the world. "There's before, and there's after, and I don't rightly know how to explain the space between them. Try." We rode up on the gate. Easy gate, wide open, like she wanted us to come in that way. His eyes had a flat, glassy look. Kane, recognized from men who'd survived a stampede or a flash flood, something that had taken the ground out from under them in a way they hadn't recovered from yet. Cal went in first. Horse went through the ground like it wasn't there at all, just gone. Horse screaming, Cal screaming, and then nothing. Just this sound coming up out of the dark like the whole earth had swallowed him. And then she was just there. His voice dropped. "No gun." I looked. God help me. I looked twice, 'cause a man doesn't ride toward 3 armed men with nothing in his hands unless he's a fool or he knows something you don't. She wasn't a fool. Kane wrote nothing down. Some things, he'd learned, weren't worth writing down, because nobody who read the report later would believe a word of it anyway. She said we had 4 seconds. The man went on, quieter now, like the memory cost him something physical to retrieve. 4 seconds to decide if we wanted to die for money we were never going to see. I didn't wait to find out if she meant it. "Where are your friends now?" "Don't know. Don't want to know." He looked up at Kane with something close to pleading. "You believe me?" Kane thought about that a long moment. Thought about the widow Voss, whom he'd met exactly twice in 4 years, both times at a distance, both times with the uneasy sense of a man standing too close to weather he didn't understand. "I believe you believe it," he said finally, which was the only honest answer he had. The man left town within the week, didn't collect what little pay he was owed for the ride out, told the last few men who'd listen, in a saloon 2 counties over, the same 4 words he'd told the sheriff, and by then the words had already started traveling faster than he could follow them. She never touched a gun. That was the story that reached Green River 3 days later. That was the story that reached Cole Hagen while he was cleaning a revolver he hadn't fired in 3 weeks. Hagen heard it from the courier, the same careful, neutral voice that had handed him the sealed letter and the $2,000, and told him nothing more than he needed to know. "Your men failed," the courier said. "They weren't my men. I sent hired hands because I wanted to see how she'd respond before I rode out myself. Now you know." Hagen set down the cloth, looked at the revolver in his hands like it had personally disappointed him. "What happened?" "Nobody's entirely sure. One of the 3 came back talking about a pit, traps. Said the widow walked out at them with a torch and no weapon, and told them they had 4 seconds to live." A pause, and they believed her. 2 of them are gone. Left the territory, best anyone can tell. The third's telling the story to anybody who'll buy him a drink. Hagen sat with that for a long moment. Because a pit in the ground wasn't luck. A pit in the ground was planning, was engineering, was somebody who understood exactly how men move in the dark, exactly where their feet would fall, exactly how to turn confidence into an 8-foot drop with no warning at all. He'd known one man who thought like that. Except that man was 13 years dead, which meant either Hagen was wrong about who he was dealing with, or he was exactly right, and that was so much worse. He didn't sleep that night. Sat instead at the small table in his rented room, the sealed letter from the courier open in front of him, the $2,000, half paid already, the other half waiting on completion, sitting in a leather pouch he hadn't touched since it arrived. He thought about his son, 12 years old, living on his sister's charity in Cheyenne because Hagen hadn't been enough of a father to keep a roof over anyone's head some years. He thought about the debt, real, immediate, not going anywhere, just because Hagen was having a crisis of conscience in a rented room above a saloon. And he thought, because he couldn't stop himself from thinking it, no matter how many times he tried to push the thought back down, about a 14-year-old girl on a boardwalk, catching her father's whole life in her arms. Addie Voss. Except she wasn't Addie Voss anymore. Hadn't been in years, Adeline now. A widow. A woman the whole territory whispered about like she wasn't quite real, like she was something between a person and a ghost story. He remembered her at the funeral. Small, silent. A stillness in her that unsettled every grown man in that church, because grief in a child is supposed to be loud, is supposed to break in some visible way, and hers hadn't. Hers had gone somewhere quiet and hard and permanent, and even at 25 years old, with a badge of his own and a decade of bad choices behind him, Hagen had looked at that 13-year-old girl, standing dry-eyed at her father's grave, and thought, something in her just became a different animal. Turns out he'd been right. He just hadn't expected to be the one riding out to find out how right. And he hadn't expected the guilt of sending other men into that darkness, instead of walking into it himself, a guilt that sat heavier, somehow, than if he'd gone and failed there in person. Because a man could tell himself a lot of things about a job he did with his own 2 hands. He couldn't tell himself nearly as much about a job he'd handed off to 3 strangers, and then sat in a rented room waiting to hear how it ended. He rode for the homestead 3 days later. Alone, this time. No hired muscle. He'd told the courier he needed to assess the situation himself before committing more men, and the courier, cold, careful, unreadable, had agreed, though not without a warning of his own. You have a matter of weeks, the courier said. After that, this stops being your job. Meaning what? Meaning the men who take over won't be sending warnings. Hagen understood exactly what that meant. Had understood it since the day he took the job, if he was honest with himself, which he tried not to be too often, because honesty in his line of work had a way of becoming very inconvenient very fast. He rode north under a sky the color of an old bruise, and somewhere around the halfway point, he started rehearsing what he'd say to her. Except every version sounded wrong. Except every version started with "I'm sorry," and ended with "I need this money." And there was no way to say both of those things to Elias Voss's daughter and have either one land the way he needed it to. So he stopped rehearsing, decided instead that he'd know what to say when he saw her face. He was wrong about that too. Everyone always was when it came to Adeline Voss. She was in the barn when he arrived, mending a bridle, hands steady, the late morning light cutting gold through the gaps in the wallboards. She heard the horse before she saw the rider. One horse. Slow. Deliberate. Not the pace of a man riding to attack, the pace of a man riding to be seen coming, which was, in its own way, more unsettling. She stepped out of the barn with a hammer still in her hand. Not a weapon, a tool. Though the way she held it, loose but ready, made the distinction feel academic. The rider stopped 30 feet out, sat his horse without dismounting. Lean face. Gray threading a dark beard. A scar along the jaw that had a story behind it she didn't know, and in that moment, didn't much care to. You're not one of the 3 from last week, she said. No, ma'am. I'm the man who sent them. Everything in her went very still. Then you should turn that horse around before I decide what to do about that. I know now, mister. I know that, too. He didn't move. Held both hands loose and open, resting on the saddle horn, where she could see them plainly. I'm not here to finish what they started. I'm here because I used to ride for your father, and I've spent 3 days trying to figure out how a man does that and still calls himself decent. She didn't lower the hammer. Say your name. Cole Hagen. She searched the name. Found, somewhere far back, a fragment of a memory. A young deputy, quiet, always a half step behind her father. The kind of presence a child registers without really seeing. She'd been 9, maybe 10. It had been a long time. You were at his funeral. Back row. Didn't think it was my place to come closer. Why not? Because I owed him my life twice over, and I still let you bury him without saying a word to you, he thought, and didn't say. Because some truths sound like excuses, no matter how carefully you phrase them. Didn't seem right, he said instead. A girl burying her father. Didn't think she needed a stranger's condolences, on top of everything else. Adeline studied him a long moment. And now I'm not a stranger with condolences, he exhaled. Looked, for the first time since he'd arrived, like a man carrying something heavier than he could set down. Now I'm a man who took money to threaten you off your own land, and sent 3 fools to do it instead of doing it myself. And I'll carry that particular kind of cowardice a good long while. The hammer in her hand tightened. You think admitting it makes it smaller. No, ma'am. I think admitting it is the only honest thing I've done in 3 weeks, and I figured you'd earned at least that much before I said anything else. She almost sent him away right then. Almost. Except something about the way he said it. Flat, unadorned, no performance in it at all, reminded her of something her father used to say. That the men worth trusting were the ones who told you the ugly truth before you asked for it. Who hired you? She said. Courier. No name given. Money smells like Cheyenne banking, not Green River saloon money. Bigger than the men who sent it want anybody to know. Union Pacific. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. A long silence between them. The wind moved through the yard. Somewhere behind the barn, a chicken complained about something. Only chickens found urgent. There's a judge, Hagen said finally. Name I've heard twice now, in rooms I wasn't supposed to be listening in on. Corrigan. Sits the circuit out of Green River and Rock Springs both. I don't have proof of anything. Just a feeling that keeps getting harder to ignore. What kind of feeling? The kind that says the railroad doesn't need to bribe a judge who's already invested in the outcome. Adeline set the hammer down against the barn wall. Slow. Deliberate. Why are you telling me this? Hagen finally dismounted. Stood at a respectful distance, hat still on, hands visible. The posture of a man who understood exactly how close he'd need to stay to that 8-foot pit if she decided this conversation wasn't going anywhere good. Because your father pulled me out of a fight I would have died in, he said. And out of a flood that near killed me twice over. And because 2 men rode home from your land last week, talking about a widow who didn't need a gun to end them, and I sat in a rented room for 3 nights straight, trying to figure out how a girl I remembered crying at her father's grave turned into that. I wasn't crying. That stopped him. At the funeral, she said. I wasn't crying. I remember that much clearly, even now. Everyone expected me to. I couldn't. Why not? Because crying, she said, felt like giving something away. And I decided, standing at that grave, that I wasn't giving anything away to anyone. Not tears. Not fear. Not land. Hagen looked at her a long moment. Your father used to say something close to that. I know, Adeline said quietly. I learned it from him. She let him stay for coffee. Not trust, not yet. Just enough patience to hear the rest of what he knew. Because 13 years of quiet, careful preparation had taught her that information was worth more than pride. And pride would have sent him off her land the moment he admitted what he'd come to do. They sat on the porch step, the same step where she'd set down a cold cup of coffee 3 nights earlier, listening for hoofbeats that had in fact arrived. Tell me about the debt, she said. Hagen's jaw tightened. What debt? You don't take a job like this for $2,000 in pride alone, Mr. Hagen. Not a man who used to ride under my father. There's a debt somewhere. Family. Most like. He looked at her like she'd reached into his coat and pulled the truth out by hand. My son, he said finally. 12 years old. Living with my sister in Cheyenne since his mother passed. There's money owed on the house. Comes due before winter. Owed to who? I don't rightly know. My sister handles the arrangement. I just know the number, and I know what happens to a family of 5 if it doesn't get paid. Adeline was quiet a moment. You understand, she said, that the same men who'd let a 12-year-old boy lose his home over a debt are very likely the same men paying you to threaten mine. Hagen's hands went still around his coffee cup. I hadn't put it together quite that way. Put it together now. He did. She watched it land on his face, watched something in him go cold and hard, in a way that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with a debt collector he'd never met, and a judge he couldn't yet prove, and a railroad company that treated whole families like line items in a ledger. I'm not going back to Cheyenne with that money, he said slowly. Not this way. Then what are you going to do? I don't know yet. He looked out over her land, gold and endless, running toward the foothills. But I know I'm not going to be the man who finishes what those three fools started. And I know I'm not sending anyone else in my place again either. Whatever comes next, I do myself, or I don't do it at all. He left before dark. Didn't ask to stay. Didn't offer false comfort or promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Just one thing, before he mounted up. There'll be more coming, he said. If not from me, from whoever the courier sends next. You made 2 men disappear off this territory in one night. That's not the kind of story that stays quiet. I know. You'll need more than a pit and a torch when it's not 3 cheap hands anymore. I know that too. He studied her a long moment. Something almost like respect in his face, tangled up with something closer to grief. Your father would be. Don't, she said. Not sharp. Just final. Don't finish that sentence. I've heard every version of it from every man in Rock Springs who thinks he knew him better than I did. Hagen nodded slowly, mounted his horse. I'll send word if I hear anything more, he said. About the judge. About who's really giving the orders. Why would you do that? Because your father once told me the difference between being fast and being right, Hagen said. Been thinking on that difference all week. Figure it's past time I acted on it. He rode south, back toward Green River, and Adeline stood on her porch a long while after the sound of his horse had faded into the wind, turning over everything he'd told her, weighing it the way her father taught her to weigh anything important, a judge named Corrigan, a railroad willing to bury a mining engineer under a lie about structural failure, and a debt-collecting scheme reaching all the way to a 12-year-old boy in Cheyenne who had nothing to do with any of it, except that his father had once owed hers a life he could never fully repay. She went inside, lit a single lamp, opened the small locked chest she kept beneath the floorboards of her bedroom, the one that held her father's revolver, never drawn, and Thomas's mining notes, carefully preserved. She didn't touch the revolver. She never did. But she took out the notes, spread them across her kitchen table, and began for the first time in 2 years to read them not as a widow grieving a husband, as an engineer's daughter, looking for what her husband had actually found. The notes were dense, technical. Thomas had a habit of writing in a private shorthand, half professional notation, and half something only he understood, and it took her the better part of 2 hours by lamplight to work through the first dozen pages. Coal seams, depth measurements, estimated tonnage, and then near the back of the third notebook, a page that made her sit very still. A survey map, hand-drawn, the Voss property boundary marked in careful ink, and beneath it, cross-sections of the coal seam running not just under her land, but under 3 neighboring homesteads as well, all 3 of which, she now recalled with a cold, sinking clarity, had sold cheap and fast in the past 8 months. And a note in the margin, dated 4 days before Thomas died, confirmed today. Seam depth insufficient for cost-effective extraction, east of Marker 7, reserves west of Marker 7, including Voss property, substantially richer than initial UP survey indicated. Must inform A. Before submitting final report to Bitter Creek foreman. Must inform A. Adeline. He'd found something that made her land more valuable than the railroad's own surveys had shown. Something he'd planned to tell her. 4 days before he died in a cave-in. The foreman called an accident. She thought, reading it, about the last morning she'd seen him alive. How he'd kissed her forehead at the door, with flour still on her hands from breakfast. How he'd said nothing unusual. Nothing that felt like a man carrying a secret worth dying over. Just an ordinary goodbye between 2 people who expected 100 more ordinary mornings exactly like it. He must have known by then. Must have been carrying the weight of what he'd found for 4 full days, deciding how and when to tell her, never once imagining he'd run out of time before he got the chance. Her hands were shaking by the time she set the notebook down. Because this wasn't circumstantial anymore. This wasn't a widow's grief looking for someone to blame. This was a document dated, specific, that placed Thomas Voss in possession of information worth killing over, 4 days before a cave-in that a company report blamed on faulty timber he had never once, in 11 years of careful engineering work, failed to properly secure. She sat at her kitchen table until the lamp burned low, staring at her husband's handwriting, and for the first time in 2 years, she let herself cry. Not for the accident, for the lie. 3 weeks passed, quiet weeks on the surface. She tended her cattle, mended fences, rode into Rock Springs twice, bought supplies, endured the same careful, sideways glances she always endured. But underneath the quiet, she was building, because a pit and a torch had stopped 3 cheap hands. Hagen had made that plain enough. Whoever came next wouldn't be cheap, and wouldn't be careless, and 3 weeks was not nearly enough time to prepare for what was coming. She needed help. Not soldiers, not gunmen. She'd sworn off that path 13 years ago and wasn't about to abandon the promise now, not when it had already proven itself more effective than a holster ever could. She needed people who understood the land the way she did. People who could be trusted with a secret that, if it got out too soon, would strip away the only advantage she had left, the fact that nobody yet understood exactly what she was capable of. She thought of 2 men. The first was Silas Bell, blacksmith, worked the forge just outside Rock Springs, had for 11 years, ever since he came west with a war wound in his leg that never fully healed, and a temperament that made most men in town give him a wide, respectful berth. He didn't talk about the war. Not to Adeline, not to anyone still living in Rock Springs who'd known him more than a decade. What little the town understood, they'd pieced together the way small towns always did, from a limp that got worse in cold weather, from the particular way he flinched at sudden sounds in his first year in the territory, and never once explained why, from a single letter that arrived every spring from somewhere back east, that he read alone in his shop with the door barred and never spoke of afterward. What Adeline knew, she knew because Thomas had told her once carefully, the way a man tells a secret that isn't fully his to tell. Silas had served as an engineer himself before the war ended him in ways that had nothing to do with the leg. Had built things meant to hold, bridges and fortifications, and watched some of them fail under circumstances no engineering could have prevented. Men lost to timing and bad luck, and decisions made by officers who'd never once picked up a shovel themselves. He'd come west afterward, looking for work that let him build things that stayed built. A horseshoe, a hinge, a gate latch that would open the same way every single time a man's hand reached for it. No surprises, no failures, nothing that could collapse on someone who trusted it. Adeline understood that kind of hunger better than most people in the territory ever could. He'd known Thomas. Forged half the reinforced fittings Thomas used in his mine survey equipment back when Thomas was still alive, and still bringing Silas hand-drawn specifications that made the old blacksmith whistle low under his breath at the precision of them. Silas had never once, in 2 years, offered Adeline the kind of pitying condolence most of the town offered instead of real help. She rode to his forge on a Tuesday morning, found him hammering out a wagon axle, sparks flying orange in the dim shop light, and waited until he set down the hammer before she spoke. "I need something built," she said, "and I need you to never speak of it to anyone." Silas wiped his hands on his apron, studied her a long moment with the same careful, unhurried attention he gave a piece of metal before deciding how to shape it. "Your husband," he said, "used to say the same thing to me. About once a month. I know. Never once told me why either." He set the axle aside, cooling. "Figure I don't need the why from you. If it's anything like his, it might be worse. Worse than a mining engineer keeping secrets from a railroad company that owned half his contracts." Silas almost smiled. "Almost. Ma'am, I've got a strong suspicion worse walked into my shop the day they told you your husband died from timber. He never once let fail in 11 years of work." Adeline went very still. "You knew I didn't know," Silas said carefully. "I suspected. Same as I suspect there's a reason you're standing in my shop right now, instead of sitting home waiting for whatever's coming next," she told him. "Not everything. Enough." By the time she left the forge 2 hours later, Silas Bell had agreed to build 6 iron jaw traps, reinforce the gate mechanisms at both entrances to her property, and keep his mouth shut about all of it until the day came that silence stopped being useful. "One more thing," he said, as she mounted her horse to leave. "What's that?" "Your father," Silas said. "Man used to stop by this shop sometimes. Before my time in town, but I heard the stories same as everyone. They say he never killed a man he didn't have to. That's true. They also say," Silas went on, "that the men who crossed him mostly wished he had, faster than what came instead." Adeline held his gaze a long moment. "Let's hope," she said quietly, "that history holds." The second was harder to find. Marshal Wade Calloway had retired from federal service 4 years back after a knee injury outside a bank in Laramie, ended a career that had spanned 3 territories, and, by most accounts, that still circulated in law enforcement circles. More successful arrests than any deputy marshal working the region. He lived alone now, a small cabin 12 miles south of Rock Springs, and by all accounts wanted nothing more to do with badges, warrants, or other men's troubles. His wife had died the year before the knee injury, a fever that took her in 9 days, despite everything the territory's best doctor could try, and Calloway had gone on working another full year after her funeral out of nothing but habit, chasing men across 3 territories with a hollowness in him that his old colleagues noticed but never mentioned aloud. The knee injury, when it finally came, outside a bank in Laramie, a bullet that shattered more bone than muscle, had felt to him at the time less like a tragedy and more like permission, a reason finally to stop. He'd spent 4 years since learning how to be a man without a badge. Split wood, fixed fences, read every book he could get sent up from Cheyenne, mostly law and history, because a mind trained 30 years to chase problems didn't simply stop chasing them just because the problems stopped coming to his door. They'd started coming to his door again the moment Adeline Voss rode into his yard. He wouldn't have admitted it to her, not directly, but some part of him had been waiting for exactly that, a reason worth the ache in his knee, worth trading the particular safety of an empty cabin for something that mattered again. Adeline rode out to find him anyway. He was chopping wood when she arrived, a big man gone a little soft around the middle with age, but with forearms that still looked like they belonged to someone 20 years younger and eyes that missed nothing as she rode into his yard. "You're the Voss widow," he said, before she'd even dismounted. "Not a question. I am. Heard some stories about you lately?" He set the axe down, leaned on the handle. "Stories that don't sound like anything a widow ought to be capable of. They're mostly true." That earned something close to a laugh from him. Short. Dry. "Mostly," he repeated. "I like a woman who leaves room for exaggeration." "There isn't any," Adeline said. "I don't shoot. Never have. Not since I was 14. Everything you've heard, I did without a gun in my hand." Calloway studied her a long, careful moment, the kind of look a lawman gives a witness he's trying to decide whether to trust. "Voss's girl," he said finally. "Not quite a question either. Just a fact settling into place. I worked a case alongside your father, years back. Cattle rustling, ring out past Cheyenne. Man was sharper than any 3 deputies I ever partnered with." "Then you understand why I'm here." "I understand you need something," he said. "Don't yet understand what," she told him. The same careful, measured version she'd given Silas, enough truth to earn trust, not so much that it put him or his cabin at risk if word ever got back to the wrong ears. Calloway listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet a long time, staring off toward the foothills. "I retired," he said finally, "because I was tired of watching men with money buy their way around the law faster than men without it could ever hope to enforce it. Figured I'd done my share. Figured somebody younger could carry it from here. I'm not asking you to carry a badge again." "No," he agreed. "You're asking me to help a woman defend her land against a railroad company and a corrupt judge with nothing but traps, patience, and a promise she made at her father's grave. That's about the shape of it, yes." Calloway picked the axe back up. For one long moment, Adeline thought he was going to send her away. Instead, he set the axe against the woodpile, straightened his back like a man settling an old debt with himself. "Elias Voss," he said, "once rode 2 days through a snowstorm to help me bring in a man who'd killed a deputy of mine. Didn't have to. Wasn't his jurisdiction. Wasn't his fight. Did it anyway, because a debt to justice doesn't check a map before it comes due." He looked at her. "I imagine his daughter feels the same way." "I do." "Then I imagine," Calloway said, "I've got one more fight left in this knee after all." By the end of that week, Adeline had what her father would have called a company. Small. Quiet. Nothing like an army. Nothing like the posse a marshal might raise in town with badges and rifles and loud, visible authority. Silas Bell, forging traps and reinforcements in secret. Wade Calloway, bringing a lawman's patience and a lawman's eye for the small details that broke cases wide open. Danny Coulter, though he didn't know it yet, running messages between them on his cattle work errands, a boy fast enough and unnoticed enough to move information nobody else could carry safely. And 60 miles south, in Green River, a man named Cole Hagen, torn between a debt to a dead legend and a debt to his own living son, gathering what scraps of truth he could about a judge named Corrigan and a railroad willing to kill a careful, honest engineer over a coal seam nobody outside a locked chest of notes even knew was real. It wasn't enough. Not yet. She knew that. Because whoever came next wouldn't ride in 3 cheap men on a careless evening. Whoever came next would come prepared, would come numerous, would come understanding, at least partly, that the widow Voss was not the easy mark her land, and her silence had led an entire territory to assume. She stood on her porch one evening near the end of that 3rd week, watching the light fade over the Wind River peaks, and let herself feel for just a moment the full weight of what she was building toward. Not a war. She wouldn't call it that. Wars had winners and losers, and bodies counted afterward like a ledger balanced in blood. What she was building was something closer to a reckoning. For Thomas, for the lie that buried him, for every homestead sold cheap and fast along a boundary line a corrupt judge and a hungry railroad had drawn without asking anyone's permission. And somewhere underneath all of it, for a 14-year-old girl on a boardwalk who swore she'd never touch a gun again, and had spent 13 years since proving that a woman didn't need one, she was about to prove it again. The decision to send 9 men instead of 3 was made in the same private room behind the Green River Courthouse, where every other decision in this business had been made, curtains drawn, a single lamp burning low enough that neither man in the room ever had to look directly at the other while they spoke. 2 lost, one running his mouth in every saloon between here and Rock Springs. Corrigan said, "This has stopped being subtle. Subtle hasn't worked. Then we stopped being subtle." Corrigan's fingers tapped once against the desk, the same nervous habit that had followed him through 15 years on the bench. 9 men. 3 directions. Whatever traps she's built, she can't watch every corner of that property at once. Overwhelm her, and this ends before winter. And if it doesn't end, if more men come home talking about pits and torches, then we stop sending men who can be questioned afterward, Corrigan said, quiet, final, the words carrying a weight neither of them examined too closely. I'd rather not reach that point. But I will, if this widow forces my hand much further. The courier said nothing to that. Simply nodded, the way he nodded at every instruction Corrigan gave him, and rode out within the hour to begin assembling 9 men who had no idea, not one of them, exactly what kind of ground they were about to be sent across. The second attack came 11 nights later. Not 3 men this time. 9. Adeline heard about it before it happened. Danny Coulter, breathless, riding hard into her yard at dusk, with a message relayed from Hagen through 2 careful intermediaries, warning her that a larger party was assembling out of Green River, that the courier had grown impatient, that whoever was giving the real orders had decided a widow's traps were an inconvenience rather than a deterrent. 9 men, riding at midnight, coming from 3 directions at once, to split her attention and overwhelm whatever defenses she'd built. She had 11 hours to prepare. She used every one of them. Silas arrived first, wagon loaded with iron traps wrapped in burlap so they wouldn't rattle, working alongside her in the fading light without wasted words, placing each device exactly where she directed, testing the tension of every spring twice before moving to the next. Calloway arrived an hour after, rifle across his saddle, moving through her property with the same unhurried, methodical care he'd once brought to 100 crime scenes across 3 territories, marking sight lines, choosing positions, explaining in low, clipped sentences where a man with a rifle could do the most good without ever needing to fire a shot unless the very worst happened. "You understand," he said to her once, checking the angle of a fence line against the rising moon, "that if this goes the way I think it's going to go, some of these men aren't walking away tonight. I understand. That going to sit right with you, after, when it's quiet again and there's nobody left to be brave in front of?" Adeline was quiet a moment. "My husband didn't get to sit with anything," she said finally. "He got buried under a lie and a company report. I don't much care anymore what sits right and what doesn't. I care about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else's husband, anyone else's land. Calloway nodded slowly. Didn't press further. Because some answers, once given, don't need to be given twice. Midnight came clear and cold, a hard moon overhead, throwing everything into sharp, silver-edged shadow. Adeline stood at the center of her property, near the well by the smokehouse, and listened. North. Hoofbeats, faint but growing. East. The same. South, a moment later. The third group, exactly as Hagen's warning had described, and exactly the direction any riders coming up from Green River would naturally take. 3 directions. 9 riders. A plan built to overwhelm a lone widow's defenses by sheer weight of numbers. They had no idea how many defenses there actually were. The North group hit the pit first, not the same pit from before, which she'd since filled and abandoned, knowing it was compromised the moment word of it reached Green River, but a new one, 20 yards further in, disguised beneath a stretch of ground that looked, in the moonlight, like nothing more than ordinary pasture. 2 horses went down hard. 2 riders thrown. The East group hit Silas's iron traps, not lethal, never meant to be, but brutal enough to a man's ankle or a horse's leg that 3 riders found themselves suddenly, urgently, no longer part of a coordinated attack and entirely part of a personal crisis. One of them, a young rider named Purdy, who'd taken the job because the money was better than anything the stockyards paid, felt his horse go sideways beneath him in the dark and understood, for one long suspended second, that he had absolutely no idea what had just happened, only that the world had turned wrong, that the ground he'd trusted his whole life to hold steady had reached up and taken something from him. He hit the dirt hard, rolled, came up running before his mind had fully caught back up with his body. Some animal part of him already understanding what his thinking mind hadn't yet accepted, that the widow they'd been promised was an easy job, was in fact the opposite of everything the courier had described. He didn't stop running until he reached the county road, 3 miles distant, and even then he kept walking, because riding home on a lamed horse felt slower than his own 2 legs. And every minute on that land behind him felt like a minute borrowed against a debt he didn't want to owe. He never rode for hire again. Told the story exactly once. To a brother back in Nebraska who didn't believe a word of it, and after that, kept it locked away someplace he didn't visit, even in memory. The South group made it further than the others, because the South group had Cole Hagen riding at the front of it. He hadn't wanted to lead this attack, had argued against it, quietly, in rooms Adeline would never see, telling the courier that a larger show of force would only provoke a woman who'd already proven she didn't scare easy, telling him, too, that he'd sworn off sending other men in his place and meant to keep that particular promise. Whatever else he broke, the courier hadn't cared about either argument. Refuse the assignment, and someone less careful takes your place. Someone who wouldn't think twice about what happened to a widow once the traps were exhausted. So Hagen rode at the front, and as his group approached the southern boundary of the Voss land, he did the only thing his conscience would let him do. He led them wrong, steered the group east of the marked trail, away from the traps he suspected Silas Bell had built, buying Adeline precious minutes she didn't know she'd been given, minutes that let her and Calloway reposition, let the North and East groups' chaos spread further before the South group ever engaged. It wasn't enough to stop the attack. It was enough to change its shape entirely. The fighting that followed was not the fighting of dime novels. No clean lines of men facing each other across an open street. No slow-motion draws. No crack of gunfire ringing out in rhythmic theatrical bursts. It was chaos, confused shouting in the dark, horses screaming, men falling into pits they never saw coming, tangled in traps they never expected, disoriented by a battlefield that refused to behave the way battlefields were supposed to behave. Calloway's rifle, fired twice, warning shots, deliberate, aimed to disable rather than kill. The careful restraint of a lawman who'd spent 30 years learning the difference between necessary force and excessive force. Each shot cracked out across the yard and was swallowed almost instantly by the larger chaos. Horses wheeling in panic, men shouting orders nobody was in a position to follow. The whole scene lit only by moonlight and the occasional flare of a struck match as someone tried, uselessly, to see the ground they were standing on. Silas worked the eastern line. With a lantern, shuttered dark, moving low along the fence, resetting a trap that had already sprung so it could catch whoever came stumbling through next. His bad legs slowed him on the uneven ground, but his hands never once fumbled the mechanism, decades of forge work having taught them a steadiness his knee had long since lost. Adeline never touched a weapon at all. She moved instead. Through the dark, through ground she'd memorized inch by inch over 18 months of patient preparation, directing chaos the way her father once directed calm, with presence, with certainty, with a voice that cut through panic like a blade. This way, she called once, to a rider stumbling blind after his horse went down, and led him, deliberately, precisely, directly into a stretch of ground Silas had reinforced with a shallow, disorienting sinkhole designed to swallow a man's confidence more than his body. He fell, cursed. Didn't get up for a long while. She didn't stop to gloat. She moved on to the next. By the time the moon had crossed a third of the sky, it was over. 4 men captured, tied, disarmed, left for Cowboy to deal with. In the morning, according to whatever careful arrangement a retired federal marshal could still command, with old contacts in territorial law enforcement. 3 more scattered, fled on foot or on whatever horses hadn't gone down in the chaos, their nerve broken entirely. And 2 didn't make it out at all. Adeline would learn at dawn, examining the ground with Cowboy at her side, exactly what had happened to them. A fall from height in the dark, a trap sprung wrong, the particular brutal math of 9 men, riding fast into ground they didn't understand. She stood over the sight a long moment. Didn't speak. You didn't do this, Cowboy said quietly, reading something in her silence. They chose to ride onto land that wasn't theirs. At midnight, to threaten a woman who'd done nothing, but refused to sell what was rightfully hers. I know. Doesn't make it sit easy. I understand that too. It doesn't, Adeline agreed. It's not supposed to. Cowboy spent the better part of that morning with the 4 captured men seated in a rough line against the barn wall, wrists bound, faces caught somewhere between shame and relief that the night had ended at all. He questioned them one at a time, patient, methodical, the same unhurried rhythm he'd once brought to 100 interrogations across 3 territories. Most of them knew little beyond their own small piece of the plan. Names of couriers, a meeting point in Green River, a promise of pay that had never once mentioned who ultimately signed for it. One of them, older than the rest, weathered enough to have ridden with worse outfits than this one, offered something closer to useful. Wasn't railroad men giving the real orders, he said. Not directly. There's a courier handles the money, but the money comes from somebody higher up, somebody careful. Never a name. Just instructions passed down clean enough that nobody above the courier ever has to answer for what happens below him. You ever see this somebody? Once. Distance. Wouldn't know his face in a crowd. The man shifted against his bindings, wincing at some ache from the night before. Wore a fine coat for a man doing dirty business, though. That much I noticed. Cowboy wrote that down. A small detail. But small details were usually the ones that mattered most. In his experience, the ones a careful man forgot to account for because he assumed nobody would ever think to ask. By mid-morning, he'd released 3 of the 4 with the same flat, quiet warning Adeline had given the first pair weeks earlier, a warning about what would happen if any of them ever rode this way again, delivered with enough conviction that not one of them doubted it. The 4th, the older one who'd talked, he kept separate, already turning over in his mind how a cooperating witness might prove useful when this whole business finally reached a courtroom. Cole Hagen found her an hour before dawn, standing alone near the smokehouse, staring south toward a horizon just beginning to gray with first light. He'd stayed behind after his own group scattered. A risk, staying. A risk that could easily have cost him everything if the wrong person saw him lingering on Voss land after an attack he'd technically led. You led them wrong on purpose, she said without turning around. East of the marked trail. I did. Why? Hagen was quiet a moment. Because I told myself for 3 weeks that I could take this job and still be the man your father pulled out of that flood. Turns out a man can't hold both those things at once. Had to choose. Chose late, I know. But I chose. 2 men are dead tonight. I know. His voice was rough. Might have been more if I hadn't ridden them wrong. Doesn't make it sit easy either, if that's what you're asking. Adeline finally turned to face him. In the gray pre-dawn light, he looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier. Older and emptier, the particular emptiness of a man who's just watched the last of his easy excuses burn away. "You didn't kill them," she said. "I led them here. They rode here on their own choice, same as every man who's come for me since this started." Her voice was steady, certain. "You want absolution, Mr. Hagen. You're asking the wrong woman. I buried a husband because of a lie these same men's employers told to cover a murder. I don't have any comfort left over for the men who work for them." Hagen absorbed that, nodded slowly. "Fair enough." But Adeline added, quieter now, "You did choose. Eventually. That's not nothing. Doesn't feel like much." "It rarely does," she said. "Right choices mostly don't. That's usually how you know they're right." They stood together a long moment in the gray light, the aftermath of the night settling around them, Calloway moving methodically among the captured men, Silas arriving with his wagon to begin the grim, practical work that violence always left behind. "Corrigan," Hagen said finally. "The judge. I've got more now than a feeling." "What do you have?" "A name of a clerk in his Green River office who's been talking too loud in the wrong saloon. And a ledger page. I only saw it for a moment, but it listed land parcels alongside dollar figures that don't match any public sale record. Your husband's name was on it." Adeline went very still. "Thomas." "Not by name," Hagen clarified. "By parcel number. But I cross-checked it against the county filing before I rode out here. It's your land, Mrs. Voss. Valued on that ledger at nearly 4 times what the railroad's public offers to you ever suggested." They knew, Adeline said slowly, the pieces settling into place with a cold, terrible clarity. They knew exactly what the coal seam was worth. Thomas found it, wrote it down 4 days before he died, and somebody made sure that information never left his notebook. "Judge Corrigan doesn't sit on ledgers like that by accident," Hagen said. "He's not just protecting the railroad's interests from the bench. He's invested, personally, in the outcome." Adeline looked south, toward Rock Springs, toward Green River beyond it, toward a courthouse and a judge's chambers where a man in a black robe had spent 2 years quietly profiting from her husband's death and her own careful, patient refusal to sell. "Then it's time," she said, "that somebody made him answer for it." "That's not a small thing you're talking about," Hagen said carefully. "A sitting judge. Railroad money behind him. You bring an accusation like that without ironclad proof, it doesn't just fail. It ends you. Everything you've built out here, gone. And you along with it, one way or another." "I know. So what's your plan?" Adeline was quiet a long moment, watching the sun finally break over the eastern ridge, gold light spilling across land that had cost her a father's peace, a husband's life, and 13 years of careful, patient reinvention. "My plan," she said finally, "is the same as it's always been." "Which is?" "Let them keep coming," she said. "Let them keep believing a woman without a gun is a woman without power. And when Corrigan finally runs out of hired men willing to ride onto this land," she looked at Hagen, something hard and clear in her eyes, "he'll have to come himself." Judge Elam Corrigan did not like surprises. He liked ledgers, liked columns that added up the way he told them to add up, liked a courtroom where the outcome was decided before the first witness ever took the stand, because that was the whole point of owning a courtroom instead of just sitting in one. He did not like waking up to a telegram that told him 9 men had ridden onto a widow's land at midnight and 2 of them hadn't ridden back. He read it twice. Standing in his study in Green River, robe still hanging on the door where he'd left it the night before, a cup of coffee going cold on the desk beside him. Elam Corrigan had not started out crooked. That was the thing nobody in Green River would have believed, looking at him now. But it was true all the same. He'd come out from a Cheyenne law practice 15 years earlier, with genuine ambitions towards something honest, had sat his first circuit bench with a young man's conviction that the territory needed steady, fair men on its benches more than it needed anything else. 2 things had worn that conviction down to nothing. The first was watching, year after year, how little a judge's salary meant against the fortunes moving through this territory on rail money and mineral rights, how every honest ruling he made seemed to enrich some distant company man in a Cheyenne office, while Corrigan himself grew older in a rented house with a leaking roof he couldn't afford to fix. The second was a single afternoon, 6 years back, when a junior clerk in a Cheyenne survey office had shown him, almost by accident, an early geological report on the Sweetwater County coal seams, a report nobody outside that office had seen yet, a report that made plain, in dry technical language, exactly which land would be worth a fortune within the decade and which would be worth nothing at all. He'd understood in that single afternoon that he was sitting on knowledge worth more than every honest ruling he'd make in the rest of his career combined. He'd told himself, at first, that he'd only use it once. One parcel, one quiet purchase, through a syndicate. Nobody could trace back to a sitting judge. Enough to fix the roof, pay off the debts, give his position the dignity it should have carried from the start. Once had become 11 parcels. And somewhere in the accumulation of all those quiet purchases, all those private syndicate meetings behind drawn curtains, Elam Corrigan had stopped being a man who occasionally bent the law for his own benefit and become something else entirely, a man whose whole remaining career existed to protect the fortune he'd already built on other people's ignorance. Thomas Voss's death had been the first time the protecting had cost more than money. Corrigan told himself, in the years since, that he hadn't ordered it directly, that the foreman at Bitter Creek had made his own choices about which reports to file and which to bury, that the timber failure, however convenient its timing, was mining country's ordinary cruelty rather than anything he'd personally arranged. He almost believed it, some days. Other days, standing in his study with a telegram in his hand, telling him 2 more men were dead because of a decision he'd made, the almost believing got harder to sustain. 2 dead, 4 captured, which was worse than dead, in its own way. Because captured men talked. Captured men, facing a rope or a long stretch in a territorial prison, had a way of remembering names they'd sworn to forget. He set the telegram down, sat very still for a long moment. Then he did what men like Corrigan always did when a plan started slipping. He reached for a bigger plan. He summoned the courier to his chambers before noon. A private room behind the courthouse, curtains drawn, the kind of room built for conversations that never happened as far as any official record was concerned. 4 men captured, Corrigan said. No greeting, no pleasantries, talking most likely to whatever passes for law enforcement out there. Marshal Calloway, the courier said. Retired. No official jurisdiction anymore. Retired doesn't mean powerless. Men like that keep friends. Corrigan's fingers drummed once against his desk. This has stopped being a land dispute. What would you call it? A liability. He said the word carefully, the way a man handles something sharp. Hagen. Where is he? The courier hesitated. Just slightly. Just long enough for Corrigan to notice. Unaccounted for since the attack. Meaning he rode with the Southern group and nobody's seen him since. Corrigan's jaw tightened. Because he'd suspected this for some time now, ever since the first report came back describing a widow, who somehow knew exactly which ground to avoid, exactly where a trap had been laid, with a precision that felt less like luck and more like inside knowledge. He's talking to her, Corrigan said. We don't know that. We don't need to know it. We need to plan as if it's true. He stood, walked to the window, looked out over Green River's dusty main street, quiet in the midday heat. Hagen has a boy in Cheyenne. Yes. And a debt. Yes. Then it's time, Corrigan said. We reminded him which debt matters more. Cole Hagen felt the shift before he understood it. 3 days after the failed attack, a letter arrived at the boarding house where he'd been staying in Green River. No name on the envelope, no signature inside, just 4 lines, in a careful, unhurried hand that made his blood run cold. Before he'd even finished reading, your sister's roof needs more than money now. There are men in Cheyenne who don't ask questions. Your boy plays alone most afternoons, near the schoolhouse. Finish the job, or explain to him yourself why you couldn't. He read it 3 times, sat down hard on the edge of his bed, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. This was a mistake. Had to be some kind of bluff, some kind of pressure meant to shake loose whatever loyalty he still had left. Except Corrigan didn't bluff. Hadn't once in 3 weeks of careful, deniable instructions passed down through a courier who never once said more than he had to, which meant this wasn't a bluff either. So what did that make it? A promise. A promise with a 12-year-old boy standing at the center of it, a boy who had no earthly idea his father's facers had put him anywhere near danger at all, until he made himself stop, made himself breathe, because panic wasn't going to get him to Cheyenne any faster. And panic wasn't going to keep a stranger's hands off his son either. Because this wasn't about $2,000 anymore. Because he'd known, somewhere in the back of his mind, that a man like Corrigan didn't let loose ends stay loose. Didn't let a hired gun walk away from a job half-finished, without making very sure that gun understood the cost of walking. He thought about his son, 12 years old, playing alone near a schoolhouse in Cheyenne, 150 miles away, with no idea that a stranger's letter had just made his safety a bargaining chip. Hagen's hands were shaking. He hated that they were shaking. Because his whole life, that had been the one thing he could rely on: steady hands, calm under pressure, the discipline Adeline Voss had drilled into him a decade and a half ago. And now here he was, 38 years old, sitting on a rented bed, with a threat against his own child clenched in a fist that wouldn't stop trembling. He saddled his horse within the hour, rode north, not toward Cheyenne, toward the Voss homestead. Adeline was in the barn, checking the tension on one of Silas's reinforced traps, when she heard the horse coming in fast. Too fast for a friendly visit. Too fast for good news. She stepped out, tool still in hand, and watched Cole Hagen ride into her yard like the devil was behind him. For the second time in this story, except this time the devil wasn't chasing him. The devil had already caught up. He swung down before the horse fully stopped. Nearly stumbled. Adeline had never seen him look like this. Not the calm, careful man from 3 weeks earlier. Not even the guilt-heavy man from the morning after the attack. This was something else. Raw. Unguarded. "They threatened my son," he said. No preamble. Voice cracking on the last word in a way he clearly hated. Who? Corrigan. Has to be. The letter didn't sign a name, but it knew things only someone close to the plan would know. Knew where my boy plays. Knew when. Adeline set the tool down slowly. "Show me." He handed her the letter, hand still unsteady. She read it once. Twice. Felt something cold and precise settle over her. Not panic. Not the frantic energy radiating off Hagen, but something colder. Something closer to calculation. "This isn't a threat from a man who's confident," she said finally. Didn't feel that way reading it. Confident men don't threaten children, Mr. Hagen. They don't have to. Confident men win quietly, through paperwork and patience, the way Corrigan's been winning for 2 years. She handed the letter back. This is a man who knows he's losing control of something, and he's reaching for the only lever he's got left. That lever is my son. I know. So what do I do? His voice cracked again, and this time he didn't try to hide it. I've got a boy 150 miles from here, and a letter telling me men are watching him play near a schoolhouse, and I don't have the first idea how to protect him from that distance. Adeline was quiet a long moment, thinking, the way her father used to go quiet before he made a decision that mattered. You don't protect him from a distance, she said finally. You end the threat at its source. Corrigan. Corrigan, she agreed. Which means we stop playing defense on my land and start bringing the fight to his courtroom. She sent Danny that same afternoon. Not to Cheyenne. That was too far and too dangerous for an 11-year-old to ride alone, but to Wade Calloway's cabin, 12 miles south, with a message asking the old marshal to come at once. Calloway arrived within 2 hours, dust still on his coat, rifle across his saddle out of habit, more than expectation. Tell me, he said. Dismounting. They told him the letter. The threat against Hagen's son. The growing certainty that Corrigan was no longer content to threaten from a safe distance. Calloway read the letter with the same careful, unhurried attention he'd once given crime scenes across 3 territories. This is a mistake on his part, he said finally. How do you figure? Hagen asked. Because a man confident in his position doesn't put threats to paper, even unsigned, even careful as this is. Calloway held the letter up to the light, studying the ink, the paper stock. This came from a Green River print shop. There's only 2 in town that carry stock this fine. Man wanted to intimidate you fast, didn't think through what he was leaving behind. You can trace it. I can ask some careful questions, quietly. Calloway folded the letter, tucked it into his coat. But tracing a letter's origin isn't enough to bring down a sitting judge, Mr. Hagen. You know that as well as I do. Then, what is enough? Calloway looked at Adeline. The ledger, he said. The one you told me about. The one with parcel numbers matching land values 4 times what the public offers ever suggested. I've never seen it myself, Adeline said. Only what Mr. Hagen described. Then we need to see it, Calloway said. In writing. in Corrigan's own hand, or close enough to it that a territorial judge, a real one, not one bought and paid for, would have to take it seriously. That means going into Green River, Hagen said slowly. Into his own offices. It does. That's not a small risk. No, Calloway agreed. It isn't. Adeline looked between the two men, the retired marshal weighing consequences with a lawman's careful patience, the hired gun turned reluctant ally with a son's safety hanging over every choice he made now. Then we don't take that risk alone, she said. And we don't take it recklessly. We plan it the way my father would have planned it. Which is? Carefully, she said. And with every advantage we can build before we ever set foot near that courthouse. The plan took 4 days to build. 4 days that felt, to Cole Hagen, like 4 years. Every hour stretched thin with the knowledge that somewhere in Cheyenne his son was playing near a schoolhouse, with no idea that strangers might be watching him. But Adeline held firm. A rushed plan gets people killed, she told him, more than once. In the same steady voice her father had used to talk, grown men down off ledges. Your son is safer with careful men moving with purpose than with a desperate father riding into a courthouse half-blind with fear. She was right. He hated that she was right. But he'd seen twice now exactly what her careful patience could accomplish against men who underestimated it. So he waited. He waited badly, though. Spent the first evening of those 4 days sitting on Adeline's porch steps, long after the planning for the day had ended, unable to make himself ride back to his rented room in Green River, unwilling to say why. She let him sit there a while before she spoke. You keep looking at me like you're trying to work something out, she said. Trying to work out how a man rides for 13 years, telling himself he's still the kind of man your father would have trusted, and then finds out how easy it was to stop being that man the first time real money got offered. You didn't stop being that man, Adeline said. You just took longer than you should have to remember which one you were. Feels like a fine distinction from where I'm sitting. It isn't fine. It's the whole distinction. She sat down on the step beside him, an easier distance than she'd have allowed weeks earlier. My father used to say, a man's character isn't the thing he does on his best day. It's the thing he does after his worst one. You had a bad month, Mr. Hagen. Question that matters now is what you do with the rest of your life because of it. He was quiet a long moment, looking out at the dark shape of the barn against a sky gone heavy with cloud. He really used to say that, word for word, more than once. Usually to deputies who'd made some mess of an arrest and come to him ashamed of it. She almost smiled. I used to think it was just something he said to make grown men feel better. Took me years to understand he meant it as a warning, as much as a comfort. Character's not a thing you earn once and keep. It's a thing you keep choosing. You choosing it right now. Letting me sit on your porch. I'm choosing it, she agreed. Doesn't mean I've forgotten what brought you here in the first place. Both things can be true. Usually are, with people worth trusting at all. Calloway spent those 4 days making quiet inquiries. Old contacts in territorial law enforcement. A former colleague now serving as a federal marshal out of Cheyenne, who owed Calloway a favor going back a decade. Word went out, careful and indirect, that Hagen's son might need watching. Not protecting outright, that would tip their hand, just watching. A friendly presence keeping loose eyes on a schoolyard from a comfortable distance. Silas spent those 4 days at his forge, building something Adeline had asked for, specifically, not a trap this time, but a small, reinforced strongbox designed to survive fire, water, and rough handling, built to protect whatever evidence they managed to recover from Corrigan's offices. He delivered it himself on the third evening, setting it on her kitchen table with the same careful pride he brought to every piece of work that mattered to him. Double-walled iron, a lock mechanism he'd designed from 3 different patterns he'd seen over the years, none of them quite right alone, all of them useful in combination. Won't stop a man determined enough with enough time, he admitted, running a thumb along the seam where the 2 walls met. Nothing built by hands ever stops a man with enough time. But it'll slow him down considerable, and considerable's usually enough. It's more than enough, Adeline said. Thank you, Silas. He waved that off the way. He waved off most gratitude, uncomfortable with it, more at ease praising the work than accepting praise for it. Man asks for good work, ought to get good work, he said simply. Rest is just doing the job right. She kept that box, long after everything else in this story had settled, as the one physical thing she never once put away in a drawer or a chest to be forgotten. It sat on her kitchen table for years afterward, holding whatever mattered most at any given season of her life. A small, stubborn piece of proof that ordinary hands, given enough care, could build something strong enough to outlast the men who'd tried to take everything from her. Danny Coulter spent those 4 days wearing a groove in the road, between the homestead, Silas's forge, and Calloway's cabin, carrying messages folded small enough to hide in a boot if it came to that, though nobody expected an 11-year-old boy on a cattle errand to draw a second glance from anyone in Sweetwater County. He'd asked, on the second day, if he could do more. More like what? Adeline had said, not looking up from the map of Green River she'd been sketching from memory at her kitchen table. I don't know. Watch the courthouse. Follow the judge around. I'm small. Nobody notices me. That's exactly why I need you doing what you're already doing, she said, and set down her pencil long enough to look at him properly. A boy who disappears into a town's routine is worth 10 men who stand out in it. You want to help me, Danny. You keep doing what you're doing. You don't go looking for more than that. But it feels like nothing. It isn't nothing. She held his gaze until she was sure he understood she meant it. Every piece of this only works because every other piece does exactly what it's supposed to, and nothing more. That's not a small job. That's the job. He'd nodded, unconvinced but obedient, and kept riding his groove in the road for 2 more days, never once knowing how many times his small, unremarkable presence had let a folded scrap of paper move safely between 3 people whose lives, by that point, depended on nobody outside their circle noticing anything at all. And Adeline spent those 4 days doing the thing she did best. Planning ground. Not her own land this time. Green River itself, the courthouse, the streets around it, the print shop Calloway had identified, the boarding house where Hagen still kept a room. She rode into town twice during those 4 days. Quiet, unremarkable. A widow buying supplies same as always. Memorizing exits and shadows and the particular rhythm of a town she'd need to move through without being noticed. Because that was the difference. She'd realized somewhere in those 4 days, between her father's world and hers. Her father walked into danger head-on, badge visible, gun ready, trusted his speed and his aim to carry him through. She walked into danger, sideways, unseen, trusted the ground beneath everyone's feet, hers and theirs both, to carry her through instead. On the second of those 4 days, sitting on Calloway's porch, while the old marshal cleaned his rifle with the same unhurried care Hagen brought to his own revolver, she found herself asking him something she hadn't planned to ask. Did you ever doubt it, she said. Retiring. Walking away from all of it. Calloway didn't look up from the rifle. Every day for the first year, he said. Told myself I'd done my part. Told myself somebody younger, faster, would carry it forward better than an old man with a bad knee ever could. Did you believe yourself? Not once. He set the rifle down, looked at her with something that wasn't quite a smile. Man doesn't retire from believing in something just because his knee gives out. He just stops being able to chase it down a street. Has to wait instead for something worth fighting for to walk up his own porch steps. And I did that. You did that, Calloway agreed. Wasn't sure I'd get the chance again. Grateful for it. Strange as that sounds, given what it's cost so far. Adeline was quiet a moment. It's cost 2 men their lives already. Men who chose to ride here, Calloway said gently, but without softening the truth of it. You didn't put a rope around their necks and lead them onto this land, Mrs. Voss. They came looking for an easy widow to frighten off good ground. Found something else instead. That's not a debt you owe anybody. She thought about that a long while. After she rode home that evening, the words settling somewhere she hadn't quite made room for yet. The night they went into Green River, the sky was overcast. No moon to speak of, which suited all of them fine. Calloway went in first, alone visible, walking the main street like any retired lawman might on any ordinary evening, drawing what little attention the quiet town had to spare. Hagen went in second, 20 minutes later, taking a longer route around the back streets, the route he knew best from 3 weeks of moving through Green River as a man on Corrigan's payroll. Adeline went in last, through the alley behind the print shop Calloway had identified, past the boarding house, toward the small, unremarkable side entrance of the courthouse building that Corrigan used for after-hours business He preferred to keep away from prying eyes. The same entrance, Hagen had confirmed, that the courier always used when delivering sealed letters and leather pouches of cash that smelled like Cheyenne banking. The door was locked. Of course it was locked. She'd expected that. Which was why she'd spent an hour that afternoon with Silas, learning the particular mechanism of the lock Hagen had described from memory, practicing on a matching one. Silas kept in his shop for exactly this kind of quiet, necessary education. The lock gave way in under 2 minutes. She slipped inside. Corrigan's private office smelled like cigar smoke and old paper. Heavy curtains blocked what little light the overcast night might have offered. So she worked by feel first, then by the thin, careful glow of a shuttered lantern she'd carried in beneath her coat. Desk. Locked drawers. 3 of them. She found the ledger in the second one. Her hands went still the moment she opened it, because there it was, laid out in Corrigan's own careful hand. No different in principle from the shorthand her own husband used to keep for his mining surveys. Except where Thomas's notes recorded honest measurements of coal and depth and tonnage, Corrigan's recorded something far uglier. Parcel numbers. Dollar figures. And beside each entry, a second column, smaller, more private, initialed rather than fully signed, recording payments that had nothing to do with any public sale. She found her own parcel number 4 pages in, valued, in Corrigan's private hand, at nearly 4 times the public offer she'd been given. And beside it, an initial she recognized instantly, because she'd seen it 100 times on legal documents throughout her marriage. E.C. Elam Corrigan. Not signing as a judge overseeing a fair transaction. Signing as an investor. She was 3 pages further in, finding, with a growing, cold certainty, that Corrigan's scheme extended to at least 11 parcels across Sweetwater County, all valued privately at far more than their public offers, all connected through a private mining syndicate that existed nowhere in any public filing. When she heard the floorboard creak behind her, she went still, turned slow, lantern light throwing long shadows across the room. Judge Elam Corrigan stood in the doorway, not in his robe, just shirt sleeves and a waistcoat, a revolver held loose but ready in his right hand, and an expression on his face that told her he'd been waiting for exactly this moment, for longer than she'd realized. "Mrs. Voss," he said, almost pleasant. The voice of a man who'd spent a career making threats sound like courtesy. "I confess I expected Hagen to come himself. Didn't think he'd send a woman to do a man's work." "He didn't send me," Adeline said. "I came on my own account. To steal from a sitting judge's private office. To recover evidence of a crime," she said. "There's a difference, though. I don't expect you to see it that way." Corrigan's mouth curved, something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're standing in my office, Mrs. Voss, holding a ledger that means nothing without context, in a territory where my word carries considerably more weight than yours ever will. Who exactly do you imagine is going to believe a widow's account of what she found in a judge's private drawer?" "I don't need them to believe my account," Adeline said steadily. "I need them to read the ledger itself. Your own hand, Judge Corrigan. Your own initials, next to every fraudulent parcel value in this county." Something flickered across his face. Small, fast, but there. Fear. "Put it down," he said, voice sharper now, the revolver rising slightly. "Put it down, and we'll discuss what a reasonable arrangement looks like. I'm not interested in your arrangements. You should be." He took a step closer. "You're a widow standing alone in a locked office at night, holding stolen property, facing a man with a legal weapon and every right to defend his own home. Do you understand how that story ends, if I choose to tell it that way?" Adeline's grip on the ledger didn't waver. "I understand exactly how that story ends," she said, "because I've heard it before. 2 years ago, about a mining engineer and a cave-in the company called an accident." Corrigan went very still. "You don't know anything about that." "I know my husband found this exact coal seam 4 days before he died," she said. "I know he wrote it down in careful detail, the same way you've written down every fraudulent parcel in this ledger. I know he planned to tell me what he'd found and never got the chance, because someone decided that information was worth more than his life. That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth," Adeline said. "And I intend to see it heard by someone who isn't standing in this room right now." Corrigan's finger tightened on the trigger. "Then I'm afraid," he said quietly, "you won't be leaving this office to see that happen." You'll shoot an unarmed widow in your own private office, Adeline said, her voice never rising, never breaking, and explain the body how exactly. To which court? Under which law? There are ways to explain a body, Mrs. Voss. I've spent a career learning most of them. You've spent a career learning how to explain away things that never needed explaining before now. She held the ledger tighter against her chest, not as a shield, simply as a fact she wasn't willing to set down. This is different. This is written down. In your own hand. There's no explaining away ink. Something his face shifted, some calculation working itself out behind his eyes. And for one terrible moment, she genuinely didn't know which way it would fall. The shot never came. Because in the half-second between Corrigan's threat and whatever he intended to do about it, the office door behind him swung open, and Wade Calloway's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Judge Corrigan. Corrigan spun, revolver swinging toward the new threat, and found himself staring down the barrel of a rifle held rock-steady in the hands of a retired federal marshal who had spent 30 years learning exactly how to stand in a doorway with a weapon and make a man reconsider every choice he was about to make. Marshal Calloway, Corrigan said, and for the first time, his voice lost its practiced calm entirely. You're retired. You have no authority here. I've got a rifle, Calloway said, and a witness to a judge threatening an unarmed woman in his own private office at midnight. Figure that's authority enough for tonight. She broke into my office to recover evidence of a fraud that's cost at least 11 families their land and one good man his life, Calloway said. We'll let a proper court sort out. Whose crime weighs heavier, Judge? Set the gun down. Corrigan didn't move. For one long, terrible moment, the room held its breath. 3 people frozen in a standoff that could have ended a dozen different ways, none of them good. Then a fourth voice spoke from the hallway behind Calloway. Elam. Corrigan's head snapped toward the sound. Cole Hagen stood in the doorway, no weapon drawn, hands open at his sides, the posture of a man who'd made his final choice and wasn't looking back from it. You threatened my son, Hagen said. Quiet, flat. More dangerous for its quiet than any shout could have been. Put a letter in my hand, telling me strangers were watching a 12-year-old boy play near his schoolhouse. That's the line, Elam. That's the one you shouldn't have crossed. Cole, don't. Hagen's voice cracked on the word, and this time he let it crack, didn't try to hide the rawness underneath it. I took your money. Sent other men to ride against a woman I had no business threatening at all, then rode against her myself, and told myself the whole, while it was just a warning, just words. Nothing that couldn't be undone. But you brought my boy into it, and there's no undoing that. Corrigan's revolver wavered. You're outnumbered, he said, though his voice had lost most of its certainty. 3 against 1. This isn't how the law works. You're right, Calloway said. It isn't, which is why we're not going to shoot you, Judge. We're going to walk you out of this office, and we're going to hand you and this ledger over to the Territorial Marshal's office in Cheyenne, where a federal judge who isn't drowning in your particular brand of corruption can decide what happens next. You think anyone in Cheyenne will take a retired marshal's word over a sitting judge's? No, Calloway said. But I think they'll take Thomas Voss's own survey notes, cross-referenced against your private ledger, showing 11 counts of fraudulent land valuation, and a pattern that points straight at a murder made to look like a mining accident. That's not my word against yours, Judge. That's paper against paper. And paper doesn't lie the way men do. Corrigan's revolver finally lowered. Not surrender. Not yet. But the first crack in a certainty that had carried him through 2 years of quiet, careful theft. The railroad he started. Doesn't even know, Adeline interrupted. Something in her voice sharpening as a new understanding settled into place. One she'd been circling for days without quite landing on. That's it, isn't it? This was never railroad business at all. Not really. Corrigan said nothing. The spur line, Adeline pressed. Union Pacific's own survey undervalued this coal seam because they'd already decided, before my husband ever confirmed otherwise, to route the new line south of here. Cheaper grade, easier construction. The company doesn't need my land at all. That's not, you knew, Adeline said. The pieces finally, fully falling into place. You knew before anyone. Some clerk's office in Cheyenne, some early survey report that crossed your desk before it, crossed anyone else's. You knew the railroad had already abandoned this route months ago. And instead of telling anyone, you kept it quiet, and you and your private syndicate started buying up land. Nobody else knew, was suddenly worthless to the railroad, and worth a fortune to anyone who understood the coal beneath it. The silence in the room stretched long in total, because she was right. Every line of the ledger, every private initial beside every parcel number, confirmed it with a clarity that made the whole ugly scheme suddenly, brutally simple. This had never been about a railroad's need. It had been about one man's greed, dressed up in a railroad's name, because a railroad's name carried weight a private judge's ambition never could on its own. 2 men dead in her yard 11 nights ago. Her husband, buried under a lie 2 years before that. Every homestead along that boundary line, sold cheap and fast to men who believed they were making way for progress. All of it, for nothing but Elam Corrigan's private fortune. Word reached Rock Springs before the wagon carrying him did. Otis Pratt heard it first, from a freight driver who'd passed the party on the Cheyenne Road, and by midday it had traveled the length of the general store counter and out into the street the way news in a small territory always did. Faster than any single rider could have carried it alone. A judge, their judge, the one who'd presided over half the disputes and debts in that county for 6 years. Arrested. Fraud, they were saying. Something about coal, something about a widow's land, something about a mining engineer's death that maybe hadn't been an accident after all. The town didn't know what to do with itself for the better part of a week. Men who'd nodded politely at Adeline Voss for 2 years, while whispering behind her back, found themselves recalculating, quietly, what kind of woman she actually was. Women who'd kept their distance out of a vague, unexamined unease started greeting her by name again at the store, the way they had before Thomas died. Before the whisper started, before a widow who didn't carry a gun became something the town didn't quite know how to categorize. Otis Pratt didn't say much about it to her directly when she rode in the following week. Just set her flour on the counter without being asked, the way he used to before any of this started, and said quiet, almost embarrassed by it. Told those 2 strangers, months back, you didn't need looking after. He didn't quite meet her eyes. Didn't know then how right I was. She didn't need him to say more than that. They took him to Cheyenne 3 days later. Calloway's contact in the federal marshal's office met them at the territorial line, took custody of both Corrigan and the ledger with the careful, procedural seriousness of a man who understood exactly how significant the evidence in his hands actually was. Corrigan didn't speak much during the ride, didn't offer excuses, didn't offer the kind of dramatic confession that might have made a tidier ending to the story. Just sat silent, in the back of a wagon he'd once have considered beneath him, watching land roll past that he'd nearly stolen through fraud and violence, and, ultimately, a scheme built on nothing more solid than a lie about a railroad's plans. The road to Cheyenne crossed open country for the better part of 2 days, empty miles where a man with money and desperation enough might still attempt something reckless, and Calloway kept his rifle within reach the entire way, watching the tree lines and the low ridges with the same unhurried vigilance he'd once given every prisoner transport of his career. Nothing came. No last desperate rescue. No ambush from whatever remained of Corrigan's syndicate hoping to silence him before he could testify against them in turn, which was, in its own way, the final proof of how alone Elam Corrigan actually was. The men who'd profited alongside him wanted nothing more to do with him now that the ledger was in federal hands. Whatever loyalty his money had purchased over the years evaporated the moment that money stopped being safe to associate with. He rode the last 50 miles into Cheyenne, watching the same empty country roll past that he'd once have owned outright, and understood, somewhere around the second evening, that the isolation of the wagon bed was going to be the shape of the rest of his life now, in one form or another. He spoke only once during that final stretch, to Adeline, riding a short distance alongside the wagon as the sun set behind them. "I never meant for it to become what it became," he said. "You won't believe that. No reason you should." "I don't need to believe it," Adeline said. "I need it stopped. It's stopped. Small comfort, I imagine." "Wasn't offered as comfort," she said. "Was offered as fact." He didn't answer that. Didn't have an answer for it, as far as she could tell, and they rode the rest of the way into Cheyenne without another word passing between them. Hagan rode alongside for the first 50 miles, then peeled off, alone, toward Cheyenne proper, toward a schoolhouse. toward a 12-year-old boy who had no idea, and would likely never fully know, exactly how close he'd come to being a bargaining chip in a corrupt judge's collapsing empire. He found his son in the schoolyard that same afternoon, kicking a ball alone against a fence while other boys ran drills nearby. And when the boy looked up and saw his father standing at the gate, he didn't run to him the way younger children might. He was 12, old enough to hold himself steady, but something in his face loosened all the same. Some tension he probably hadn't even known he'd been carrying. "You're early," the boy said. Aunt Ruth said, "You weren't coming till next month." "Plans changed," Hagen said. And then, because he didn't trust himself to say anything more complicated than that without his voice breaking, he simply crouched down the way Elias Voss used to crouch down to talk to somebody who needed the truth said plainly, and added, "I'm not leaving again for a good while." Figured that was worth changing the plan. For the boy studied him a moment, the way children study adults when they suspect there's a larger story being kept from them. "Is something wrong?" "Was?" Hagen said. "Isn't anymore. Not for you anyhow. That's the part that matters. You look tired, Pa." "I am tired." He almost laughed at the plain honesty of it, coming from a 12-year-old who'd never once learned to soften a true observation just to spare a grown man's feelings. "Been a hard few weeks. Good kind of hard, though, if there's such a thing. The kind that ends somewhere worth ending. Aunt Ruth said you were working for some judge." "Was?" Hagen said again and left it there, because some truths a father owes his son eventually, and some truths a father owes him only the shape of. Not the sharp edges. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Not anymore. "Come on. Walk with me a while before supper. Tell me what I've missed." The boy fell into step beside him, and for the first time in longer than Hagen could easily remember, the walking felt like it was going somewhere instead of away from something. Adeline watched him go that morning from the edge of her own land and stood a long while after the dust of his horse had settled, thinking not about Corrigan or the ledger or the 11 stolen parcels, but about a boy in Cheyenne who would grow up, never fully knowing how close the ground beneath his own life had come to giving way. Some debts, she thought, get repaid in exactly that kind of silence, the kind that protects instead of hides. The territorial proceedings took the better part of 2 months. Adeline testified twice, once before a federal marshal in Cheyenne, once before a territorial judge with no ties to Green River or Corrigan's syndicate, laying out everything with the same calm, measured precision she'd brought to every trap she'd ever built. Calloway coached her through the second appearance the evening before, sitting across from her at his own kitchen table with a cup of coffee neither of them drank. "They'll try to rattle you," he said. "Corrigan can afford good counsel still, whatever else he's lost. Man'll come at you sideways, try to make the truth sound stranger than the lie. Let him try. I mean it, Adeline. He'll ask things designed to make a courtroom doubt a woman who did what you did without a gun in her hand. Some of it'll feel like an insult. Might be an insult, some of it. I've survived worse insults than a lawyer's questions. I know you have." He studied her a long moment, something almost paternal in it, though neither of them would have named it that directly. "Just answer plain. Don't reach for more than what's true. The truth's carried you this far. No reason to dress it up now." She thought about that advice more than once the following morning, standing at the witness stand with a gallery full of strangers watching her the way the whole territory had learned to watch her, uncertain whether to be afraid or amazed. The second appearance was the harder of the two. A proper courtroom, high windows letting in gray winter light, a gallery half full of strangers who'd read about the widow and the judge in newspapers that had, by then, carried the story as far as Denver. She stood at the witness stand in a plain dark dress, hands folded in front of her, and answered every question the prosecutor asked in a voice that never once rose or wavered, not when she described the pit at the North Gate, not when she described the letter threatening a 12-year-old boy, not even when Corrigan's own counsel, a sharp-faced man from Cheyenne with a voice built for doubt, suggested that a woman capable of the things she'd done to defend her land might be capable of exaggerating a judge's guilt to cover for it. "I've never once exaggerated anything in my life, sir," she said. "I haven't had to. The truth's always been strange enough on its own." Corrigan's counsel tried a different angle after that, leaning on the rail of the witness stand with the particular condescension of a man used to juries believing him by default. "You'd have this court believe," he said, That a 27-year-old widow, alone on a homestead, managed to defeat armed men on multiple occasions without ever once picking up a weapon. I'd have this court believe exactly what happened, Adeline said. Whether it's easy to believe isn't something I've ever had control over. It seems, Mrs. Voss, remarkably convenient. Convenient. She let the words sit a moment before she answered it. My husband is dead. My father is dead 13 years now. I've spent every one of those years learning to survive on land that half this territory wanted taken from me by whatever means proved cheapest. There's nothing convenient in any of that, sir. There's only what it cost to still be standing here to tell you about it. The gallery had gone very quiet by the time she finished. Even the prosecutor, who'd heard the account already in private, found himself sitting a little straighter in his chair. That line made it into 2 newspapers by the following week. Thomas's notes were entered as evidence. Corrigan's ledger was entered as evidence. The clerk from Corrigan's own office, the one who'd been talking too loud in the wrong saloon, exactly as Hagen had described weeks earlier, testified to the private syndicate's dealings in exchange for leniency of his own. He was a nervous, narrow man named Whitfield, and he spent most of his testimony staring at his own hands rather than at the judge who'd once been his employer, describing in halting detail how he'd been asked, over the years, to file certain documents in ways that obscured their true purpose, how he'd told himself each small request was harmless on its own, how the accumulation of small harmless requests had eventually become something he no longer recognized as harmless at all, but felt powerless to refuse. Why come forward now? The prosecutor asked him. Whitfield was quiet a long moment. Because I kept telling myself it wasn't my place to question a judge, he said finally. Kept telling myself that until a woman walked into a courtroom and proved a person's place isn't decided by what they're told it is. It's decided by what they're willing to stand up and say out loud. It wasn't eloquent testimony, wasn't delivered with any particular confidence, but it was honest, and honesty, in that courtroom, on that particular afternoon, carried more weight than anything Corrigan's expensive counsel could offer in response. And piece by piece, the story that Judge Elam Corrigan had built over 2 careful years came apart in a courtroom that, for once, actually deserved the title of justice. Corrigan spent the nights before his own hearing in a federal holding cell in Cheyenne, a narrow room with a cot and a barred window that let in more cold than light, and found himself, more than once, running back over the 6 years since that Cheyenne clerk had shown him a survey report nobody else was supposed to see. He'd told himself at every step that he was owed something, that a lifetime of honest rulings, undercompensated and unthanked, entitled him to one quiet advantage nobody would ever trace. He'd believed that story long enough, told it convincingly enough, that some nights in that cell he still caught himself reaching for it out of pure habit, the way a man reaches for a coat he's worn so long he's forgotten. It isn't part of him. But the cot was narrow, and the nights were long, and somewhere around the 3rd night he stopped reaching for the story at all. Because a story that required a mining engineer's death to hold together had never been worth telling in the first place. He wouldn't hang. The evidence, damning as it was, pointed to fraud and conspiracy rather than a hand, directly on the timber that killed Thomas Voss. That particular truth, the how of the cave-in itself, would likely never be fully proven, a grief Adeline learned to carry rather than resolve. But he would never sit a bench again, would spend the better part of the next decade in a territorial prison, stripped of every parcel his syndicate had fraudulently acquired, every one of those 11 homesteads restored, where restoration was even still possible, to the families who'd sold cheap and fast under threats they'd never fully understood. It wasn't everything, it was enough. She rode home from Cheyenne alone, 4 days on the trail with nothing but her own thoughts and the wide, indifferent sky for company, and somewhere on the 2nd day, crossing a stretch of open plain that could have belonged to any year, any decade, any story, she let herself think, fully and without flinching, about everything the last 2 years had cost her. A husband, a quiet life she'd never quite gotten back after the first lowball offer arrived. A version of herself that might have existed if none of it had ever happened. A version that would never build a pit at a gate or memorize the give of ground near a smokehouse or learn to read a threatening letter for what it revealed about a frightened man's weakness. She didn't know if she mourned that other version of herself or not. Decided, somewhere around the 3rd day, that it didn't much matter either way. That woman hadn't survived what needed surviving. This one had. Cole Hagen returned to the Voss homestead in early autumn, frost still silvering the grass on the morning he rode in, and this time Adeline watched him come without a hammer in her hand, without the old, careful readiness that had defined every one of their earlier meetings. He dismounted slow, stood at a respectful distance, same as always. "My boy's settled in Cheyenne for good now," he said. "Aunt Ruth's roof is paid clear. Turns out the debt itself traced back to Corrigan's syndicate too. One more piece of a scheme that reached further than any of us fully understood at the start. I'm glad. Came to say something else too." He turned his hat over once in his hands, an old nervous habit she'd noticed in him from their very first conversation. "I'm not going back to that line of work. Whatever I do next, it won't be taking money to threaten people who never did anything to deserve it. What will you do?" "Don't rightly know yet." He looked out over her land. Gold now, autumn gold, the harvest mostly in, the fences standing solid against a sky gone crisp and blue. "Thought maybe I'd start by making something instead of threatening it." Silas mentioned he could use a second set of hands at the forge, now that half the county wants reinforced gates and fence lines after word got around about what happened out here. Adeline almost smiled. Almost. Word got around. "Ma'am, word got around clear to Cheyenne. There's already 3 different versions of the story making the rounds in saloons from here to Green River. One of them's got you fighting off 30 men singles-handed, with nothing but a torch and a prayer. That's not what happened." "No," Hagen agreed. "But I've stopped trying to correct people. Figure the truth's stranger than the story anyway, and stranger stories don't sell as many drinks." Word did travel. In the months that followed, grew the way stories always grow, edges sharpening and softening in turn as they passed from mouth to mouth across a territory hungry for something to believe in. The widow Voss, they called her now, when they weren't calling her something less kind, though the less kind versions grew rarer with every passing season as the plain, verified facts of the case settled into the public record. A woman who never carried a gun, a woman who'd stopped a corrupt judge's fraud scheme not with a weapon, but with patience, engineering, and a stubborn refusal to give up land that was rightfully hers. Danny Coulter told the story more than anyone, grown a full inch that year, still all elbows and energy, still telling anyone who'd listen about the wolf, and the pit, and the torch, and the widow who never once needed a gun to end what needed ending. Some still didn't believe him. He'd stopped minding. Before any of that, on a quiet morning with the first frost still silver on the grass, Adeline rode the 6 miles to the small cemetery outside Rock Springs, where her father was buried, and beside him, in ground still new enough that the grass hadn't fully taken, her husband. She didn't visit often. Told herself it wasn't necessary, that carrying them properly in daily life mattered more than kneeling at a stone twice a year. But that morning felt different. The way certain mornings do after something long and terrible has finally ended, and she found herself wanting to say something out loud to 2 men who could no longer hear it, if only to hear the words exist in the world at all. She knelt first at her father's grave, rested her hand flat against the cold stone, the way she used to rest it against his sleeve as a girl. "I kept it," she said. 13 years. Never once broke it, not even the night it would have been easier to. The wind moved through the grass. No answer came. None had ever come. But she'd learned long ago that the absence of an answer wasn't the same as the absence of being heard. "I don't know if what I'd built instead was what you would have wanted for me," she went on. "I know it's what I needed. Maybe that's the same thing. Maybe it never was." She moved to Thomas's grave next. Newer stone, sharper edges, grass still finding its way to fill in the disturbed earth around it. "They know now," she said simply. "What you found, what it cost you to find it. It won't bring you back. I understood that a long time before I understood anything else about the last 2 years. But it's not a lie anymore. Nobody gets to call it an accident and have that be the end of the story." She stayed a long while, longer than she'd planned to, the sun climbing slow behind gray autumn cloud, and when she finally stood, brushing the frost from her knees the way she used to brush garden dirt from them, something in her chest had settled that hadn't settled in 2 years. Not peace, exactly. Something steadier than that. Something that didn't need to be borrowed and given back. Adeline stood on her porch one evening in late autumn, watching the light fade over the Wind River peaks, the same view she'd watched 100 times before, the same view that had watched her build a life out of grief and patience, and a promise made at her father's grave 13 years earlier. The land was hers, fully, finally, legally hers, with no cloud of fraudulent valuation hanging over it, no corrupt judge circling with private schemes disguised as public progress. The coal beneath it, real, valuable, exactly as Thomas had discovered, would eventually draw honest interest from honest buyers in years to come, on terms she alone would choose to accept or refuse. But that evening, she wasn't thinking about coal, or courts, or the long, careful work still ahead of her. She was thinking about her father, about the boardwalk, about catching a weight she never expected to carry, and the promise she'd made at his grave, with dirt still fresh on her hands. Never touch a gun again. She'd kept that promise for 13 years. Would keep it, she suspected, for the rest of her life. Not because she couldn't shoot, not because the skill her father gave her had faded with disuse, but because she'd found something in the years since that mattered more than speed, more than aim, more than the particular violence a gun could offer. She'd found a different kind of strength, the kind that read ground the way other people read faces, the kind that turned grief into patience, and patience into preparation, and preparation into a quiet, terrible certainty that no man riding onto her land with bad intentions would ever fully understand until it was already too late for him to matter. 3 men had ridden toward her homestead at the start of all this. Not one of them rode back, and in the 2 years since, more than a dozen had followed, each certain that a woman alone, unarmed, undefended, would be easy. None of them had been right. Somewhere out past the north pasture, she could hear the low, steady creak of the windmill turning, pumping water toward the barn the same way it had every evening of her life on this land. Ordinary, unremarkable, hiding, the way so many ordinary things did, exactly how deep it really ran underneath. She'd learned that from her father, though he'd never lived to see how far she'd carry the lesson. She'd learned it from Thomas, too, in the quiet mathematics of ground and water and consequence that he'd loved enough to spend a whole life mastering. And she'd taught it, in the end, to an entire territory that had underestimated her. Every hired gun, every corrupt judge, every man who ever rode onto her land, believing a widow without a weapon was a widow without power. They were wrong. They always would be. Because the most dangerous person in any room isn't always the one holding the gun. Sometimes it's the one who never needed one at all. Men rode onto her land for 2 more years after Corrigan's conviction, fewer of them each season. Mostly drifters who hadn't heard the story, clearly enough to know better, mostly gone before sunrise, with nothing worse than a bruised pride and a warning they never forgot. None of them came for the reasons the first 3 had, because the reason itself was gone, buried alongside a judge's ambition in a Cheyenne courtroom, alongside a scheme that had cost 1 honest man his life, and 11 families their peace of mind, alongside a lie that had called itself an accident for 2 long years, before the truth finally outweighed it. What remained was simply a woman on good land, tending cattle, mending fences, watching the same gold light fall over the same foothills every evening of a life she'd built herself, 1 careful season at a time. They still tell the story in Sweetwater County, some 60 years on now, though the men who lived it have long since passed into the same quiet ground that holds every story eventually. Children hear it the way Danny Coulter once told it, wide-eyed and breathless, half certain no grown-up in the room believes a word of it. A widow. No rifle at her hip, no revolver on her belt, nothing in her hands but a torch and a certainty. Nothing in this territory ever quite matched. They came for an easy woman on easy land. They found out 1 careful season at a time exactly how wrong a man can be about what a person is capable of when everything worth protecting is finally on the line. She never touched a gun. She never needed to.